Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the silk curtains of the Forbidden City to explore a side of imperial life that your high school textbooks definitely did not prepare you for. That's right, sex, concubines and imperial desire in ancient China. And before we go any further, fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Not emotionally, not psychologically, and certainly not if you've ever fantasized about royal romance being anything more than ritualized paperwork and suspiciously choreographed midnight visits. The truth? It wasn't all steamy glances and flower-scented scrolls. We're talking bureaucratic seduction, schedules carved into jade tablets, eunuchs guarding bedchambers, and emperors who sometimes didn't even get to pick their own partners. Oh, and let's not forget the elaborate positions dictated by astrology, Confucian morality, and occasionally sheer boredom. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these dimly lit strolls through history's most awkward hallways. And hey, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing which corners of the world are staying up late with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, slowly, curiously, and just a little scandalously. You're not standing in the 21st century anymore. You're somewhere far back about 1200 years ago, behind the heavy wooden doors of a Tang dynasty palace. The air smells faintly of sandalwood, goose oil, and ink-stained parchment. Gold-threaded curtains drift like ghosts across the lattice windows. And at the center of it all, silently obeyed, ritualistically served, and almost mythically cloaked in expectation, sits the emperor. To understand sex in the Tang court, you must first forget almost everything you think you know about royal intimacy. For this was not a matter of personal desire, it was a matter of state policy, medical doctrine, and celestial balance. The Tang dynasty 618–907 CE was an era of innovation, open trade, and cultural flourishing. But inside the imperial bedroom, tradition held tight. Sex for the emperor wasn't private, it was strategic. The emperor's vitality was considered the very pulse of the nation. If his yang energy declined, crops might fail. If his yang balance slipped, earthquakes could follow. His nightly routines, therefore, were monitored, advised upon, and even scheduled. Each emperor was provided with a bedroom guidebook, sometimes written by Confucian scholars, sometimes by Taoist physicians. These manuals outlined who he should sleep with, on which days, for how long, and in what season. Some manuals dictated positions, claiming certain postures preserved essence better than others. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about preservation, and the scheduling, oh, it was meticulous. During the reign of Emperor Seronzong, a record was kept of the concubines in rotation, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. The selection process was, in itself, an act of ritual. A eunuch would present ivory plaques, each bearing the name of a woman in the harem. The emperor would choose a plaque, which would then be placed in warm water to ensure the woman's name floated upright, symbolizing auspiciousness. But even then, protocol reigned. A concubine summoned could not enter the emperor's chambers wearing her own clothes. She had to be undressed by eunuchs and carried on a quilt so as not to dirty the path, and she had to leave before dawn, silently, without ceremony. Meanwhile, court physicians tracked the emperor's jing, the vital fluid. Too much loss, and he'd fall ill. Too little expression, and he risked stagnation. Thus, the emperor was discouraged from orgasm in most sessions. The Taoists believed retaining semen led to longevity and cosmic power. Some emperors went decades practicing non-ejaculatory methods under Taoist guidance. Of course, this clinical approach to sex didn't mean the palace lacked desire. Love letters, suggestive poetry, and secret affections pulsed beneath the surface. Many concubines tried to gain favor through emotional intimacy rather than physical contact. Learning music, perfecting poetry, or developing specialized dance rituals meant only for the imperial gaze. The Emperor Gaozong, for example, was utterly enamored with Empress Wu Zetian, not for her beauty alone but for her intelligence and cunning. When she first entered the court as a low-ranking concubine, Wu composed verses for him in the voice of the moon, comparing herself to jade dew on spring petals. Her intellect captivated Gaozong so thoroughly that he gradually elevated her through the ranks, ultimately naming her empress, and later she would become China's only female emperor in her own right. But not every concubine succeeded. Behind the palace walls, rejection was quiet but brutal. A concubine who failed to catch the emperor's eye might spend decades in luxurious obscurity, her body perfumed and manicured for a man who never remembered her name. These forgotten women, often teenagers when they arrived, aged in silence, few ever returned home. And then there were the eunuchs, the silent orchestrators, The gatekeepers. Their role was far more than ceremonial. Many eunuchs became masters of information, surveillance and influence. Some kept personal ledgers of who the emperor favored most. These lists could determine which family gained court influence or which general rose in the ranks. Sex, in the Tang court, was never just sex. It was a political web woven between silk sheets. And for the emperor, pleasure was secondary to protocol. Some emperors suffered from the constant weight of expectation. Emperor Zhongzong once lamented to his physician that he felt more like a ritual object than a man. His intimate life was so overmanaged, he confessed, that he longed for even one night where he could fall asleep without being told whom to touch. Yet not all emperors were dutiful in following the manuals. Emperor Zhongzong, famous for his passionate affair with consort Yang Guifei, eventually ignored much of the advice. Their romance, though legendary, led to upheaval. Zhongzong's obsession with Yang was said to distract him from governance, weakening the empire's grip and contributing to the disastrous Anlushan rebellion. Even in love, there were consequences. And yet even consort Yang, beloved and pampered, followed certain protocols before entering the emperor's chamber. She was known for bathing in milk and clove-scented water before midnight and walking barefoot to avoid any disruptive sounds. Her hair was pinned in silence. Her perfume, sourced from distant islands, was applied in precise amounts. One drop too much could seem vulgar. You might imagine these rituals were cold or unfeeling, but for those involved, they could also offer a strange kind of purpose. In a palace where your worth was measured in fleeting attention, a single glance from the emperor, however orchestrated, could mean everything. But why did the Tang dynasty take such a highly structured, regulated approach to something as intimate as sex? And what happened when emperors resisted these strict doctrines? The more you understand the Tang court's approach to imperial intimacy, the more you realize that the rules weren't just written in ink, they were carved into the bones of the empire itself. And yet bones crack, even under silk robes and behind golden screens. Emperors were still men. Desire, boredom, rebellion, it all simmered beneath the smooth veneer of protocol. Emperor Xuanzong's affair with consort Yang Guifei was not merely legendary because of love. It was scandalous because of how boldly it disregarded centuries of state practice. By the time Xuanzong took the throne in the early 8th century, the protocols of the imperial harem were well defined and closely guarded. The emperor's sexual partners were supposed to rotate evenly through a system, ensuring fairness among concubines and reinforcing Taoist harmony. But Yang Guifei, formerly the wife of Xuanzong's own son, broke that rotation entirely. She was first noticed not for her beauty, but for her voice, a soft melodic tone that, according to court diaries, carried the grief of spring rain and the playfulness of mountain birds. Xuanzong summoned her under the pretense of poetry lessons. Before long she became his primary consort, and he ceased following the official schedule of concubines altogether. This caused uproar, not just among the women of the palace, who began to protest privately through coded letters and complaints to eunuchs, but among ministers and ritual advisors. Ignoring the bedroom manual meant upsetting the delicate spiritual balance between yin and yang that, in theory, protected the empire. The emperor's body wasn't his alone. It was a symbol of divine order. Every time he chose Yang Guifei, he was denying balance. Ministers feared calamity. Earthquakes, famine or rebellion could follow from such selfish indulgence, and indeed, one did. The Anlushan rebellion broke out in 755. Anlushan, a general who had curried favor through Yang's family, eventually turned against the Tang court. Xuanzong's distraction, his failure to manage his military officials and court politics, was partially blamed on his infatuation. In the end, he fled the capital. Yang Guifei was strangled by his own guards under public pressure. Her body was hastily buried under a pear tree. The emperor reportedly never smiled again. But Xuanzong was not the first, nor the last, to let passion unravel the threads of duty. Another example comes from the lesser-known Emperor Muzong. Unlike his ancestors, Muzong openly resented the constant intervention of court physicians in his bedroom life. In one surviving letter, written in a tone rare for an emperor, he sarcastically refers to his own body as a leased temple, rented nightly for the state's blessings. He defied scheduling and, more shockingly, began favoring lower-ranking concubines who had not passed through official palace channels. This caused an administrative crisis. Eunuchs, unsure how to log the events, began omitting details from the bedroom records. That meant fewer reports were sent to the Ministry of Rites. It disrupted the alignment of birth predictions, harvest ceremonies, and even the royal calendar. Such were the consequences of impulsive attraction in a system that made intimacy part of the state apparatus. Eunuchs played a strange and central role in this system. Their presence in the emperor's bedroom was constant, though largely invisible. They managed candles, arranged bedding, regulated incense, and ensured that nothing occurred off schedule. Some eunuchs even timed the duration of each encounter. Others took notes, coded, symbolic records that logged everything from the color of a concubine's robe to the exact placement of pillows. These notes were not meant to be read casually. They were used for astrological alignment and health diagnostics. If the emperor fell ill, these records helped determine whether the fault lay in too much yin, imbalanced earth signs, or excessive essence loss. One physician from the court of Emperor Suzong once wrote an entire treatise blaming the emperor's poor digestion on an overindulgence in concubines born in the year of the rabbit. And yet, not all emperors rejected these traditions. Some leaned into them with fascination. Emperor Taizong, one of the dynasty's earlier rulers, was known for personally annotating his bedroom records. He would rate the spiritual harmony of each night's encounter with a set of brushstrokes, short for calm, long for invigorated, twisted for confused. This quiet, coded language was never meant for anyone but himself. It was a private diary beneath the public logs, but despite all this structure and symbolism, not every night in the palace was scripted. Rumors lingered, hidden between scroll margins and whispered in tea houses. Stories of concubines sneaking through servant corridors, accounts of eunuchs bribed to alter the schedule, even suspicions that emperors occasionally visited the kitchens, not for food but for forbidden company. One tale, passed down through unofficial court chronicles, tells of an emperor who fell in love with a chambermaid who prepared his inkstones. She knew the balance of water to soot better than anyone in the palace. Over time, he began requesting ink at odd hours, late in the night, under the pretense of spontaneous poetry. Eventually, she disappeared from the records. Whether she was banished, promoted, or quietly absorbed into the harem is unknown. But in his later years, that emperor's calligraphy grew shakier, as though missing something only she had steadied. So what happens when a system designed to control desire inevitably fails to contain it? When rules meet emotion, and routine is upended by longing? And why did the palace, for all its order, keep building more rooms instead of fewer rooms for poetry, rooms for dance, rooms where love was both forbidden and quietly expected? By the time the Tang dynasty began its slow decline in the 9th century, the empire's outer walls were crumbling, but inside the palace, the silk beds remained freshly made. Rituals endured. The bedroom manual, though faded and frayed, still sat on carved jade stands in chambers heavy with incense. But something had shifted. What had once been accepted as sacred order was beginning to feel like repetition without meaning. For the emperors who followed Xuanzong and Muzong, the romantic ideals of palace life gave way to duty-bound apathy. Emperor Xuanzong, for example, inherited not only the empire, but also the heavy volume of intimate instructions. Yet in his later court writings he remarked that sex in the palace was more shadow than substance, a parade of silk and breath. He wasn't exaggerating. By this point in the Tang era, the harem had become so over-bureaucratized that many concubines were selected by administrative rank rather than emotional compatibility. Entire families maneuvered to place daughters in the palace, not for love but for status. These women arrived trained, perfumed, and prepared, but few of them ever saw the emperor at all. Eunuchs, once seen as servants, now wielded disproportionate power, managing access not just to the imperial bed, but to the throne room itself. As court intrigue deepened, sex became a currency of influence, not affection. It wasn't uncommon for families to send tributes alongside their daughters, rare fabrics, herbs, poetry, even exotic pets, all in the hope of catching imperial interest for one night. But the emperor himself, he was often trapped in ritual. If he dared deviate too far, he risked cosmic punishment. If he obeyed too strictly, he risked loneliness. A paradox wrapped in brocade. One of the most curious outcomes of this system was the quiet resilience of concubines themselves. Forbidden from speaking directly about their desires or disappointments, many turned to art. There's a preserved hand scroll from the late Tang period depicting a female musician with her guqin. Look closely, and you'll see a small poetic inscription in the corner. Translated, it reads, "He summoned the wind, but not me, so I summoned a song he cannot silence." Many concubines learned to carve delicate messages into the undersides of furniture. Others wrote poems meant never to be read aloud, as though preserving a private breath inside the public roar. Some turned to Buddhism, finding spiritual freedom in chanting rituals where the body, finally, was irrelevant. But perhaps the most overlooked voices are those of the eunuchs. Despite being dismissed in modern imagination as passive bystanders, these men, many of whom were forcibly castrated as children, became keepers of the palace's most intimate secrets. They understood the emotional climate of the court better than anyone. Some even ghost-wrote love poems for concubines hoping to gain favor. Others edited the emperor's romantic correspondence, choosing words that would please, flatter, or subtly manipulate. In private memoirs from the Five Dynasties period, following the Tang collapse, one former eunuch writes about his final year in service. "I carried warmth where love did not reach. I kept time where clocks had no chime. I saw men become gods, and gods become bored." It's not a line you'd find in an official history, but it tells you everything you need to know about the atmosphere behind those gilded doors. And then, as dynasties shifted and the Tang gave way to the Song, many of these rituals were reformed or abandoned. The bedroom manuals became historical curiosities. The strict sexual calendaring fell out of favor. Emperors became less bound by Taoist restraint and more curious about individual pleasure. But the legacy lingered. Even centuries later, Qing dynasty emperors still used fragments of Tang-era rituals to justify their own intimate decisions. When Emperor Qinglong was criticized for favoring a single concubine for over a year, he cited ancient harmonic exceptions used by Tang emperors in times of political unrest. The idea that the emperor's bedroom had cosmic consequences while softened never truly disappeared. Modern historians today continue to debate just how much these protocols influenced the fate of the dynasty. Was Yuanzong's love for Yang Guifei truly the cause of the Anlushan rebellion, or was that just a convenient scapegoat for deeper political failings? Did the bedroom manuals help preserve the emperor's health, or slowly isolate him from real human connection? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the folds of an unused silk pillowcase, or the brittle parchment of a forgotten schedule. What we do know is this: the Tang imperial bedroom was not a place of spontaneous pleasure. It was a woven tapestry of symbolism, surveillance, and expectation. A place where the deepest human urges were turned into matters of protocol and performance. And yet, even in that tightly wound world, desire found cracks, concubines smuggled notes, eunuchs whispered secrets, emperors stared too long at one face among hundreds, and behind all of it was a question no ritual could fully answer. Can love survive a schedule? In the end, what survived were not the manuals nor the rituals. What endured were the poems, the songs, and the glances that escaped the gaze of history. They are faint, like perfume on old fabric, but if you listen closely, they're still there, waiting just beyond the curtain. You're floating now, not in time, but in scent. The air is thick with rose oil, cardamom, and the faintest trace of smoke from clove-stuffed apple tobacco. Soft footsteps whisper across polished tiles, and silk rustles behind lattice screens. You're in the Topkapi Palace, somewhere near the end of the 16th century. Somewhere deep within, far beyond the reach of daylight or common noise, lies the harem, an empire within an empire. Let us begin with a simple truth. The Ottoman harem was not a den of debauchery, as Western travelers like to claim, nor was it merely a prison of silken beds and passive beauty. It was a place of politics, lineage, ambition, and yes, the occasional pillow war. To enter the harem was to step into a society with its own laws, hierarchies, and strategies. The women within were not merely lovers-in-waiting, they were tacticians, scholars, rivals, poets, and survivors. At the top stood the Validi Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Once a concubine herself, the Validi ruled the harem with a political shrewdness that rivaled the Grand Vizier. She managed everything: the daily schedules, internal punishments, education, etiquette, even bedchamber arrangements. Her word was law, and her power extended far beyond the tiled halls. Ministers knew to cross the Validi was to risk a career-ending whisper in the Sultan's ear. Beneath her were the Khadins, official consorts of the Sultan, usually 4 at most. Their rank determined everything from the embroidery on their pillows to the number of servants they were allowed. Below them, the Iqbals, favourites, and still further, the Gozdas, those who had merely caught the Sultan's eye. And beneath even them, the new girls, often foreign-born, freshly renamed, and barely old enough to know which direction faced Mecca. But how did a girl rise through the ranks? Not through seduction alone. In fact, direct flirtation was frowned upon. Everything was done through ritual, modesty, and the slow weaving of alliances. Each concubine was trained upon entry. She learned court Turkish, Quranic verses, music, embroidery, and the rules of intimate decorum. No perfume was to be worn without approval. No laughter could exceed a whisper. Meals were eaten kneeling, eyes cast downward. The punishment for breaking even minor protocol could be swift exile to the old palace, a fate worse than death for many. But behind the strict decorum, the competition was constant. These women vied not just for affection, but for survival. Bearing the Sultan a child, especially a son, was the ultimate prize. Motherhood conferred both safety and power. Without it, a woman could age into silence, forgotten among the cushions. And so alliances were made. Among the most curious traditions was the quiet pillow gifting, an unspoken system of favours and signals. To gift another woman a feather-filled pillow of goose down was to offer peace. To return a pillow with new embroidery stitched overnight was to accept that peace. But to ignore the gift entirely, that was a declaration of rivalry. Some concubines even developed coded messages through needlework. A peacock feather might symbolize cunning, a tulip meant compliance, an embroidered cat, surprisingly common, was a subtle jab suggesting the recipient was too quiet to be trusted. At night, the harem didn't sleep all at once. In fact, sleep was a fragile thing here. Some women stayed up reciting prayers, others composed poetry on scraps of silk and tucked them behind tiles. Servants walked barefoot between chambers, lighting fresh candles or delivering messages under strict confidentiality. Eunuchs, ever present, ever silent, patrolled the corridors and mediated disputes. But not even the Sultan was exempt from harem politics. When the Sultan wished to summon a concubine, he would indicate it to the chief black eunuch, known as the Kislar Argusi, who controlled the inner court. The eunuch would then notify the woman's chamber. She had 1 hour to bathe, be dressed, and present herself with absolute calm. Panic, joy, or nervousness were not permitted. She must appear as though summoned daily, graceful, unshaken, serene. And what of the Sultan himself? He rarely chose based on desire alone. Like the Chinese emperors, his virility was considered state property. But unlike the Chinese system, Ottoman sultans did not marry. Every child was born of a concubine, making the hierarchy fluid and dangerous. The risk? Intrigue, jealousy, poison, pillow wars. One such rivalry became legend, the battle between Mahidevran and Hurrem. Mahidevran was the mother of the Sultan's eldest son and held great sway. But when Hurrem, once a captured Ruthenian girl, entered the harem, everything changed. She was clever, fluent in languages, and disarmingly modest. She didn't compete openly. Instead, she wrote poetry, she composed lullabies, she laughed only once a day, always at the same hour, to seem predictable. Slowly, the Sultan's affection shifted. Mahidevran, known for her sharp temper, began losing influence. Rumours spread of scuffles. One account, likely exaggerated, claims Mahidevran struck Hurrem in a jealous rage, leaving visible scratches. Whatever the truth, it ended with Hurrem gaining unprecedented access to the Sultan's private council. She became the first concubine in history to marry a sultan, officially, publicly. This broke centuries of tradition, and it ignited silent rebellion throughout the palace. Not all women wanted to rise, some simply wanted peace. These were the quiet ones, those who found small joys in privacy, embroidery, or scripture. One unnamed Gozde, known only through her letters to her sister outside the palace, once wrote, "Let them rise. I am content to grow old near the courtyard fig tree. Its fruit is honest, the world is not." But even she, content unnoticed, was eventually caught in a political ripple when the Sultan's son was executed in a succession dispute. She, like many others, was transferred to the old palace. The Eski Saray, the palace for retired or unfavoured women, was a cold place, grand in structure but lifeless. Few servants, fewer opportunities. Some women lived there for 30 years in quiet twilight, their stories like dust collected in corners. But back in Topkapi, the rituals carried on. The bedding was changed hourly, mirrors were polished daily despite being rarely used, birds were kept in cages to bring music, but only certain species, nightingales, never parrots. Curtains were to be drawn at specific angles to let in modest light, and every concubine was expected to perfect her bow, not just in posture but in rhythm. A single beat too fast could imply impatience. So what was love, here? What was intimacy, when every movement was measured? Did the Sultan ever pause before choosing a name from the list? Did the concubines, behind their calm smiles, ever dream of lives beyond these marbled corridors? Did the pillows hold more than feathers, or were they filled with whispered hopes, unsent letters, and long nights of pretending not to want more? As the 16th century pressed on, the harem, once imagined by outsiders as a place of pleasure and passivity, transformed into something even more extraordinary, a political engine. One governed not by swords or titles, but by veils, silence, and embroidered whispers. By the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the harem had reached its apex not just in size, but in strategic influence. The term harem agasi, master of the harem, no longer applied solely to men. because behind the lattice screens the women were ruling. To understand the transformation, you must first understand the unspoken rule of succession in the Ottoman world. Only one son could inherit the throne. That meant multiple princes were raised within the palace, but only one would survive into rule. The others, born of other concubines, were exiled, imprisoned, or worse. This brutal system meant every mother within the harem became her son's first fiercest campaign manager. And so a new power began to rise, the Hasaki Sultan, the Sultan's favourite consort and often the mother of his eldest surviving son. Once this title was bestowed, a woman's influence surpassed even the Grand Vizier. Her quarters were relocated to prime locations within the palace, closer to the Sultan's own. Her fabrics became finer, her guards doubled, and her daily schedule synchronized with the movements of the court. No Hasaki wielded this role more skillfully than Hurrem Sultan, the woman who had once embroidered lullabies and stitched cat motifs onto pillowcases to mock her rivals. Now she was writing official correspondence to foreign powers on behalf of the Sultan. In her careful, educated Turkish, she signed her letters, Hurrem, in eternal gratitude for the protection of Allah and my Lord. She didn't need a royal seal. Her name was power enough. Hurrem wasn't just a favourite. She was the architect of a dynasty. She used her influence to arrange advantageous marriages for her daughters, fund mosques and schools in her name, and most controversially, encourage the execution of Suleiman's firstborn son by Mahidevran. Historians still debate the details. Was it palace gossip or political truth? Did Hurrem manipulate the Sultan into removing Mahidevran's son to secure her own child's rise? Or was it merely the consequence of the Ottoman law of succession, carried out with cold inevitability? Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. Hurrem's son Selim II would become Sultan. And this opened the door for a century of matriarchal influence now known as the Sultanate of Women. From the mid-1500s through the early 1600s, mothers and wives of Ottoman sultans shaped policy, governance and diplomacy in ways never before seen. Their influence was subtle but potent. They funded public works under their own names. They placed loyal eunuchs in high administrative positions. They corresponded with European monarchs as political equals, veiled behind carefully chosen phrases. But inside the harem, this power came at a cost. Rivalries deepened. Where once the gifting of a goose-down pillow had been symbolic, now it could imply allegiance or treason. Embroidery patterns grew more elaborate, with symbols not just of emotion but of factional loyalty. The stitching of a cypress tree, for example, came to suggest strength and rootedness, used exclusively by concubines aligned with the Valid Sultan's household. The Valide herself, once merely the Sultan's mother, became the most feared and respected woman in the empire. Her chamber was larger than any concubine's. She commanded a staff of dozens, including scholars and secretaries. She had her own audience days, during which high-ranking officials sought her guidance. But even she walked carefully. The harem was a web, and to pull too hard on one thread was to tremble the whole structure. One such tremble came during the reign of Murad IV, a sultan born to a concubine named Kusim. Kusim Sultan was astoundingly shrewd, patient, and well-versed in court politics. She assumed the position of Valide after her son's accession, and served as regent when he was too young to rule. Kusim issued imperial orders. She appointed governors. She managed military finance, all without ever sitting on the throne. But as her sons came of age, the question of control returned. Her influence began to breed suspicion. Letters were intercepted, allegiances questioned. One of her sons eventually turned against her, and depending on which account you believe, she was either quietly retired or strangled by palace agents in her own chambers. Even the most powerful pillow can't soften the weight of politics. Outside the palace walls, the world was watching. European ambassadors wrote secret reports back to their courts detailing the remarkable women of Topkapi. Some feared their influence, others admired it. One Venetian diplomat wrote in 1606, "If the Sultan's eyes are the moon, then his mother's mind is the sun unseen, but always setting the hour." Yet within the palace, day-to-day life still followed its slow, ceremonial rhythm. Bathing rituals continued. Water had to be drawn from specific fountains. Soap infused with orange peel and goat's milk was lathered by handmaidens who spoke only in prayers. Afterwards, women were wrapped in 7 layers of gauze to ensure skin cooled slowly, preserving beauty and calmness. Meals were still quiet affairs. Bowls of sweet rice, dates and spiced lamb, eaten while seated on silk rugs, fingers dipped in rosewater before and after each course. Conversation was minimal. Laughter, if allowed, was hushed. But one sound never left the harem, the scratching of needles on fabric. Even as wars raged beyond the Bosphorus, the women of the harem stitched. They embroidered veils with verses. They mended sleeves and gifted handkerchiefs. One concubine, exiled to the old palace after a political misstep, stitched her own life story into the hem of a curtain, an act of quiet rebellion, so intricate it was discovered only centuries later, preserved in dust and lace. And still the pillow wars continued, not with shouts or weapons, but with glances, patterns and rituals passed from hand to hand like secret scrolls. So how did love fit into this world? For some, it never arrived. They died waiting. For others, it came in the form of a single gaze across the baths, or in the unexpected softness of a sultan's sigh, or in the knowledge that their embroidered tulip, left silently on a pillow, had not been returned, but had also not been discarded, in a place where every gesture was rehearsed. Perhaps the truest emotion was the one that broke the pattern. But what happens when the thread frays, when power once quietly managed from behind the curtains is challenged openly? And how did the rise of these women echo into the later centuries of the empire, through rebellion, reform, or quiet reinvention? By the dawn of the 18th century, the once mighty whispers of the harem had begun to fade, not overnight, and not in a single wave, but gradually, like the slow extinguishing of a perfumed lamp. The Sultanate of Women, the era where mothers, lovers and consorts shaped the Ottoman Empire from behind ornate screens, was ending. But its legacy refused to vanish. The decline began not with a bang but with succession. After the reigns of powerful women like Kosum and Turhan, the structure of Ottoman rule shifted. Sultans grew more reclusive, secluded in palatial complexes far removed from daily governance. Ministers and military leaders assumed more visible power. The harem, once a nerve center of diplomacy and lineage, was increasingly perceived as a relic of a grander past. Still, the rituals remained. As if afraid to let go of the poetry, the palace maintained the motions. The concubines still arrived, renamed, perfumed and veiled. The Valide Sultan still offered guidance, though now more ceremonial than strategic. The eunuchs still paced the halls, older, slower, their eyes carrying memories no longer relevant, but the rooms felt emptier. In the 1700s, fewer concubines bore sons, fewer sons grew to rule. The old palace began to fill, not just with aging favourites, but with women who had never even been summoned. They wandered wide, tiled halls, practicing embroidery, memorising verses, and teaching one another the etiquette of a court that no longer truly functioned. It was said that by 1780, there were over 1,000 women living in the old palace, some of whom had not spoken to a man in 30 years. A French visitor, granted rare access under diplomatic pretense, wrote, "They are like ghosts wrapped in silk, reciting prayers to a sky that no longer listens." But not all had faded. A few still played their games. In the time of Sultan Mahmud I, a lesser-known concubine named Dilferes began rising through the ranks, not by political cunning, but by cultivating an unlikely reputation: honesty. Where others flattered, she answered plainly. Where rivals embroidered hidden messages, she sowed birds and vines with no deeper meaning. The Sultan, wearied by layers of deceit, found her plainness refreshing. She became his confidante, not a power player, not a strategist, just a woman who had stopped playing the game and thus won it. Dilferes never bore a son, she never became valide, and yet her name appears in court diaries for nearly a decade, recorded not as an influencer, but as a companion of quiet evenings. In a world built on performance, that was its own kind of revolution. Meanwhile, Europe's fascination with the Ottoman harem peaked. Paintings, travelogues and fiction filled the imaginations of people who had never seen a Turkish pillow, let alone a palace. These depictions, often eroticized and wildly inaccurate, overshadowed the real stories, the bureaucratic routines, the strategic sewing circles, the small victories of overlooked women. And yet those very misconceptions helped preserve the memory of the harem long after its political relevance had faded. When the Ottoman Empire entered its final century in the 1800s, reforms swept the state. Western-style governance replaced traditional power structures. Slavery was gradually abolished. The harem itself, once the epicenter of imperial lineage, was now viewed as an outdated symbol of absolutism. Still, the Topkapi harem functioned until the early 20th century. The final sultans, including Abdülmecid II, kept a drastically reduced household. By then, the women of the harem were no longer enslaved concubines, but salaried courtiers. Some were educated abroad, some published poetry under pseudonyms. One even became a noted calligrapher, her scrolls displayed discreetly in Istanbul's mosques. Then came the collapse. When the Ottoman monarchy was abolished in 1924, the harem system vanished in a single decree. The women were dismissed with pensions. The eunuchs retired or faded into poverty. The old palace was shut. The Topkapi became a museum. And with that, the Great Silence began. No more pillow gifts, no more embroidered metaphors, No more secret alliances carried on the breeze of rosewater and sandalwood. But even in disappearance, the harem left traces. Ottoman women who had once lived within its walls carried their discipline and refinement into civilian life. Some became educators, others married into republican families. A few simply vanished into quiet anonymity, their skills unneeded in the new world. Yet echoes remained. In modern Turkey there are still fragments, whispers passed down from grandmothers, family stories about great-aunts who once embroidered veils in the Valide's court. And if you walk the quiet corridors of Topkapi today, you'll find them. Rooms so still, they hum, a chamber where light filters in at a perfect diagonal, as if someone once instructed it so. A closet full of empty drawers labelled not with names, but with flowers. Lotus, almond, jasmine, reminders of the women who were once known only by symbols. You might even find an old pillow, faded and slightly misshapen. If you look closely, you'll see the stitching, not a cat or a cypress or even a tulip, but a single curved line, unbroken, looping once and then fading into thread. Was it a signature, a protest, a joke, or just the last breath of a war fought in silence beneath silk? The truth is, the Ottoman harem was not what most believed it to be. It was more restrained, more structured, more quietly powerful than the stories suggest. Its weapons were velvet and voice. Its victories were subtle but real. And though it is gone, its lessons remain. That even in the most rigid of systems, women found ways to speak. That desire suppressed by ritual still burns quietly through poems and prayer. And that politics, even when hidden beneath veils and candlelight, can reshape empires. So when you think of the harem, try not to picture only the fantasies. Picture instead the quiet strategist, the steady needle, and the whispered lullaby echoing down marble halls. A mixture of lavender water, coal smoke, and something faintly unpleasant, something human and quietly ignored. You're in London, perhaps, or Manchester, maybe a parlour in Edinburgh. It's the 1850s, and the age of progress is in full swing. Railways are roaring, telegrams are buzzing, and yet someone still just dumped a chamber pot out the upstairs window. Welcome to the world of Victorian hygiene, where modesty and morality reigned, but the bathwater was often cold and shared once a week. Despite the outward elegance of the era, corsets, cravats, polished boots, the truth beneath the starch and lace was often far less glamorous. Cleanliness was valued, yes, but rarely understood in terms of germ theory. Instead, it was wrapped in spiritual language, cleanliness as godliness, not necessarily as a defense against disease. The typical middle-class Victorian home contained a washstand in each bedroom. On it, a porcelain basin and pitcher, perhaps floral in design. Morning ablutions involved a splash of cold water to the face and hands. Soap was used, though sparingly, and towels were shared among family members. The idea of a full-body wash every day was considered excessive, even dangerous. Why dangerous? Because many Victorians believed that too much bathing, especially with hot water, could weaken the nerves or invite illness. The skin, after all, was porous. Open it too frequently, and who knew what might get in? That's not to say people didn't bathe at all. Once a week was typical for the average family. Saturday night baths were common, especially for children, taken in a tin tub placed in the kitchen. Water was heated on the stove, poured carefully, and reused by multiple family members. Eldest son first, then younger siblings, then perhaps the parents. Last in line, the housemaid if she was lucky. Toothbrushing was equally curious. Early Victorian toothbrushes featured bone or ivory handles and stiff boar bristles. Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't quite exist yet. Many used powders made of crushed charcoal, salt or baking soda. Some recipes even included brick dust. Yes, literal powdered brick. Dentists advised moderation, noting that overuse might remove enamel. And so brushing once a day, or even once every few days, was typical, especially among the lower classes. Mouthwash? A rinse of brandy or diluted vinegar might do. But the breath of a well-bred gentleman was more likely to be masked by mints or clove-studded oranges than any real dental intervention. And what of intimacy? Here, things become delicate. Not because the Victorians lacked desire, but because they wrapped it tightly in euphemism. The body was something to be managed, not celebrated. Even marital advice manuals avoided direct language. One 1864 volume titled A Guide to Matrimonial Harmony described the marital act as the lawful embrace undertaken with reverence and purpose, not delight. Bedrooms were private, of course, but in a practical way. Many homes, especially in cities, were small. Children shared rooms. Servants slept in attics or below stairs. Privacy was often a curtain, not a door. Couples often slept in separate beds, and in wealthier households, separate bedrooms entirely. Shared bedrooms were for reproduction, not necessarily affection. Still, the Victorians weren't devoid of tenderness. Love letters were common, filled with florid prose and poetic longing. Courtship was a slow, ritualized dance of glances, chaperoned visits and coded gestures. A dropped handkerchief, a gloved touch, a flower left in a book. Intimacy was built not in moments of passion, but in layers of mutual restraint. When a couple finally married, many entered their wedding night with very little understanding of what was to occur. Sexual education was practically non-existent, especially for women. Mothers might offer vague advice, phrases like, "It will be your duty," or "He must not be disturbed." The shock of the reality for some was profound. Enter the strange and quiet world of Victorian intimacy manuals, often published anonymously, sometimes banned, always curious. These texts, sold discreetly in bookshops or by mail, ranged from the purely medical to the morally infused. Titles like Hints for Husbands or Onanism, the silent destroyer of health, warned against excess, promoted moderation, and often couched everything in religious or pseudo-scientific terms. According to one manual, intercourse more than once a week could lead to blindness, weakness of the knees, or melancholic reflection. Masturbation was condemned outright, particularly for young boys. Parents were advised to sew mittens onto pajamas or tie hands at night. One doctor recommended blunt discipline and cold showers for wayward sons. Girls were presumed not to suffer from such impulses, and thus received no instruction whatsoever. And yet, beneath all this repression, a countercurrent flowed. Some couples ignored the manuals. Some found joy in shared baths, stolen kisses in candlelit kitchens, or in poetry passed under dinner plates. Servants often knew more than their masters, having overheard more than they ought. And in the private journals of a few bold women, we find evidence of passion, not lewd, but deeply felt, and earnestly recorded. One such woman, Eleanor B., wrote in her 1872 diary, "Though he does not speak of love, I see it in his hands, in the way he places my coat on the hook, in how he says my name after prayer." For her, intimacy was not a violent disruption of modesty, but a soft and unfolding awareness. Meanwhile, public health reformers were beginning to knock at the doors of these private lives. They brought with them new ideas: germ theory, sanitation, soap as salvation, not sin. By the 1880s, public bathhouses began appearing in London and other major cities. These offered working-class families access to clean, heated water, usually once a week for a small fee. Posters encouraged regular bathing. Clean skin means health, they proclaimed. Toothpaste, too, evolved. By 1890, toothpaste in collapsible tubes had arrived, modelled after artists' paint tubes. Mass production made it affordable. The brush evolved from boar hair to nylon. Advertisements began to link cleanliness, not just with morality, but with attractiveness. "White teeth win brides," one 1895 ad exclaimed. It was a strange shift. Where once purity meant restraint, now it suggested a kind of modern sparkle. The Victorians were adapting, slowly, awkwardly, but adapting all the same. Yet even as soap became sacred and mint toothpaste common, many taboos endured, euphemisms clung tight. One could still not say leg in polite company. Limb was preferred. A piano's legs were covered with small cloth skirts, just in case their curves provoked something inappropriate. So what does all of this tell us? That cleanliness was always a negotiation between fear and faith, between ritual and reality. That intimacy was not denied, only redirected. That a cold bath on a winter morning could be both a spiritual exercise and a deeply unpleasant shock. And that beneath corsets and collars, there beat hearts every bit as warm, confused and hopeful as our own. But how did this world, so tightly laced in modesty, handle moments of illness, childbirth or desire? How did couples communicate across a lifetime, when words failed, or when etiquette prevented even the naming of body parts? Let us step now into a quieter room. It is lit by gaslight or perhaps a single oil lamp, its wick trimmed low. The curtains are drawn against the sooty street. The wallpaper is yellowed by time, its pattern faded. At the room's centre lies a narrow bed, and in it, someone is coughing. Welcome to the Victorian sick room, the place where hygiene, intimacy, and taboo collided most intimately. Contrary to modern hospitals, the care of the ill during the Victorian period took place primarily at home. There were doctors, yes, but they made house calls infrequently and often late. Their remedies ranged from leeches to mustard plasters, and their understanding of contagion was inconsistent at best. The real care work fell to wives, daughters, servants, and sometimes to husbands, who learned tenderness in the shadow of fever. Here, bodily intimacy was unavoidable. A woman who had never uttered the word nipple might now be tasked with soaking a cloth and wiping her husband's chest during a bronchial infection. A husband, who perhaps had never seen his wife undressed in daylight, would now sponge her back while she sweated through a fever. Illness stripped away layers of formality. It made people human. But even in these moments, modesty remained a force of habit. It was not uncommon for a screen to be placed between the patient and caregiver, with arms reaching around from behind it. Speech was hushed. Exposed skin was quickly covered. A basin was kept nearby, not just for vomit, but to carry away anything unseemly. Quietly, without fuss, cleanliness took on new urgency. Sheets were boiled when possible. Underclothes were changed more often. A common household guide recommended that no sick person be allowed to marinate in the scent of their own misfortune, and so lavender sachets and vinegar rinses were employed. Windows were cracked open for a breath of God's air, even in midwinter, and always the brush. Hair brushing was considered an essential part of Victorian hygiene, especially for the ill. For women, long hair could become matted or tangled during bed rest. Brushing, 100 strokes gently, was both a grooming act and a symbol of care. Many saw it as a form of emotional connection, something tender, repetitive, and calming. Diaries from the time often describe this ritual in loving detail. He brushed my hair without speaking. Each stroke made my breath steadier. I counted to 70 before sleep took me. But not all bodies in bed were ill. Childbirth, too, brought its own strange mingling of intimacy and silence. Despite the Victorian obsession with purity, nearly all births occurred at home, often in the same bedroom where meals had been taken, prayers said, and children conceived. A midwife was usually present, though her social standing varied. In wealthier homes, a physician might attend, though most male doctors still held the process at arm's length, intervening only when complications arose. Births were messy, loud, and frightening, and yet spoken of afterward in vague euphemisms. A woman who had just laboured for 12 hours might be described as having been under strain or visited by the ordeal. Rarely was the word birth even used aloud. Still, the experience bonded couples in subtle ways. For many men, the weeks following childbirth were the first time they truly touched their wives without pretense. Feeding broth, lifting pillows, rubbing ankles against swelling, these acts were simple but quietly intimate. After the birth, a custom called lying in began. The new mother would remain in bed for at least 10 days, sometimes a month, while servants or family cared for her. The room was to be kept warm and quiet. Visitors were limited, and the husband, he was often more present than expected. Letters between new fathers and their wives, written just rooms apart, reveal tenderness and awe. I hear your breath before I reach the door. That is enough for today. These moments, so ordinary, so rarely celebrated, were where Victorian intimacy quietly flourished. And then, too, there were the lovers who never touched. Unmarried couples in the Victorian era were bound by strict propriety. Courtship was a slow, often frustrating affair, made up of chaperoned visits, supervised dances, and letters passed through family intermediaries. But desire found a way. Handwriting became a medium of passion, a smudge of ink, a forgotten yours without the expected sincerely, a pressed flower that still carried the scent of a gloved wrist. For some, stolen contact became an entire language. Gloves brushed against gloves, ankles visible beneath the hem of a skirt during a step, caused hearts to race. A faint cough before entering a room, rehearsed and repeated, became a kind of secret knock. Even within these constraints, people found ways to say, "I see you, I am waiting." And still, bodies needed tending. Even unmarried women dealt with their own hygienic routines, many of which were deeply private and poorly understood. Menstruation, for example, remained a topic of near-total silence. Girls often discovered it by accident, terrified, ashamed, and unequipped. Mothers, when they did speak of it, referred to it as the change or the monthly. Sanitary products were rudimentary. Rags pinned in place with safety pins, soaked and washed by hand, always in secret. Disposal was discreet. Drying took place under beds, away from sunlight. A servant finding such cloth might pretend not to notice. Even adult women often avoided looking at their own bodies directly. Mirrors were used for hair and collars, not exploration. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to know very little about her anatomy, even after childbirth. Yet, paradoxically, Victorian clothing itself required great bodily awareness. Corsets worn tightly demanded precise breathing and posture. Petticoats, bustles, stockings, all required daily adjusting. Servants helped, yes, but many women developed intimate familiarity with their limbs, their waistlines, the angle of their ribs. They may not have named these parts aloud, but they knew them, and the acts of daily dressing and undressing, especially within marriage, became another form of intimacy. A husband loosening a corset string was not just a lover, he was a partner in a daily ritual, a witness to vulnerability. In fiction, this was often romanticized, but in reality, it was often quiet, habitual, even boring. And in that boredom lay a kind of intimacy that modern stories often overlook, because sometimes love is a man helping his wife pin her hair in silence, or a woman folding her husband's handkerchief just so. So what happened when all this was interrupted? When war came, or death, or modernity? How did the habits of the Victorian bedroom and all its silence shape what came next? It is said that the Victorians loved death almost as much as they feared it, and in no place was this more visible than in their bedrooms, the same space where they bathed, prayed, gave birth, made love however quietly, and eventually died. Let us sit now in one such room. The bed is draped in dark fabric. The mirrors have been covered with cloth to prevent the departing soul from being reflected and trapped. On the bedside table, a clock has been stopped, frozen at the exact moment of death. The body lies beneath a white sheet, limbs straightened, jaw bound, eyes gently closed by a family member or servant. This is not a hospital scene. This is a Victorian deathbed, and it is as much a part of their culture of intimacy as courtship or childbirth. You see, the Victorians believed that dying was a final performance, one that should be conducted with dignity, composure and presence. A well-kept room, a freshly washed body, and a familiar touch on the hand were all essential. Families gathered, not to interfere but to witness, to hold space, to say nothing but to mean everything. And so hygiene in this final context became a kind of sacred duty. The face of the deceased was wiped with rosewater, the hands were folded with care. Sometimes the final combing of the hair or brushing of teeth was done by the spouse. These rituals were not about sanitation, they were about love, and the belief that care of the body mattered, even as it stilled. This attitude extended to mourning as well. After death, women, particularly widows, were expected to observe strict mourning rituals. Black clothing, heavy veils, no jewelry, and avoidance of social engagements for at least a year. Personal hygiene during this time was minimal. Excessive grooming was considered improper, baths were shorter, cosmetics discouraged. But the grief-stricken still longed for touch, and many widows recorded their continued care of their late husband's belongings, his shaving kit, his hairbrush, his nightshirt, kept and even cleaned regularly, long after his passing. These quiet acts of maintenance were, in a way, their own form of intimacy. And while the emotional world of the Victorians was rich and deeply felt, the physical world was rapidly changing. By the late 19th century, science began to challenge the older beliefs about health and hygiene. Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory reached England. Hospitals became cleaner. Soap advertisements changed their tone from moral to microbial. Protect your family from invisible enemies, one 1897 poster warned. Sanitation reformers like Florence Nightingale advocated for fresh air, hand-washing, and daily bathing, especially in medical settings. Her work during the Crimean War proved that cleanliness could save lives, not just reputations. Nurses began to replace midwives, hospitals began to replace bedrooms, and doctors became more hands-on, more precise, and less embarrassed by the human body. The bedroom, too, began to shift. Running water became more common in urban homes. Indoor plumbing replaced chamber pots. Baths moved from kitchens to their own tiled rooms. Soap, once expensive, was now a household staple. Toothbrushes became standardized, and tooth powders were increasingly flavored with mint and clove rather than chalk or ash. And along with these changes came a slow unraveling of silence. Couples began to talk, tentatively, then more freely about their needs, their health, even their desires. A new wave of literature emerged, medical books written not in code but in plain language. Some, like Married Love by Dr. Marie Stopes, 1918, would not appear until the Edwardian era, but they had their roots in Victorian quietude. And as society grew louder, more industrial, more secular, more mobile, the bedroom transformed from a moral stage into a place of privacy and retreat. Yet traces of the old ways lingered. Elderly Victorians carried their habits with them, a reverence for modesty, an aversion to certain words, and a belief that love was proven not through grand passion, but through quiet routines, a freshly ironed handkerchief, a toothbrush laid out before bed, the unspoken sharing of a teacup. These gestures endured, even as the corsets loosened and the bathrooms brightened. So what remains of that world today? Perhaps more than we realize. The phrase cleanliness is next to godliness still recited, the bouquet of lavender in the bathroom, the way we lower our voices at night, the way we reach for someone's hand when they're unwell, the way some couples still use coded phrases, old habits or gentle rituals to express care without the need for constant explanation. The Victorians were not cold, they were cautious, and in that caution they built a culture where even the smallest gestures carried great weight. So the next time you lay your head on a pillow, or close a door quietly so someone may rest, you might find yourself echoing a world long gone but not forgotten. A world where intimacy was less about speaking and more about staying. But when the 20th century came roaring in with its bright lights, roaring jazz, and modern medicine, what happened to these habits? Did they disappear? Or did they evolve, hidden beneath new routines, waiting to be rediscovered? The city is Tenochtitlan. The year is somewhere before the Spanish ships appear on the horizon. The air is high, dry and bright with the scent of roasted maize, crushed marigold, and clean morning smoke. Beneath the shadow of stone temples and canals humming with paddle boats, something private is unfolding behind a modest adobe wall. It is a wedding, an Aztec wedding, and it is not what you might expect. To the Aztecs, marriage wasn't just a social milestone, it was a cosmic arrangement, an act that affected not only the couple but the sun, the harvest, and the very balance of the universe. And yet it was also grounded in very real earthly things. Who would fetch water, who would grind maize, and who would sweep the courtyard at dawn. Let us begin with how a match was made. Marriage was arranged, but not coldly. Parents played the leading role, but always with the help of matchmakers, known as Siwatlamakazkwe. These elderly women were deeply respected and often consulted astrologers to determine compatibility. A favorable union depended on more than love. The birthday of each party, calculated using the Aztec tonal Poswali calendar, was scrutinized for signs of harmony, misfortune, or divine interference. If a union passed these tests, the boy's parents sent gifts to the girl's household: tobacco, cacao beans, woven cloaks, and sometimes a live bird. These were not bribes, they were symbols of sincerity and abundance. If the girl's family accepted, the preparations began. But the bride and groom, they did not yet meet. This was not a courtship in the modern sense. The couple may have seen each other from afar, at the market perhaps, or during festivals, but direct conversation was rare, and intimacy. That was something to be learned slowly, after the wedding itself. The ceremony took place at night in the house of the groom's parents. Candles flickered in clay holders, a fire burned low in the hearth, watched carefully by older women to ensure it didn't go out, a terrible omen. The bride arrived barefoot, her hair tied in 2 long braids. Her body was bathed in flower water earlier that day by her mother and aunts. She wore a red skirt with black edging, and a blouse embroidered with symbols of earth and water. On her back she carried a small woven mat, a gift from her family, representing the domestic life she was about to begin. The groom, dressed in white cotton, waited silently beside the elders. Then came the binding. In the center of the room, the couple sat cross-legged on a reed mat. A matchmaker tied the corners of the bride's and groom's tunics together at the shoulder, creating a literal and symbolic knot. They did not speak. Words belonged to the elders and the gods. A priest offered blessings to Sikchiquetzal, the goddess of beauty and fertility, and to Zaitatlapoca, the god of destiny. If all went smoothly, the couple was led to the groom's quarters, where a new hearth was lit in their honor. This fire was theirs to tend, day after day. In Aztec culture, a shared fire was as binding as any vow. For the next 4 days, the couple fasted and slept apart, under supervision. They performed domestic duties for each other's families, grinding maize, fetching water, helping with weaving or firewood. It was a trial of sorts, a preparation. Only on the 5th day would they sleep together. And sleep itself, it was not hurried. The mat and blankets, called petids, were arranged with care. Feathers, especially those from waterfowl or quetzals, were prized for bedding, though rarely used except by the upper classes. A couple fortunate enough to sleep on feathered mats was believed to begin married life in comfort, balance, and good fortune. As for the act of intimacy, it was not spoken of directly, but neither was it cloaked in shame. In Aztec culture, sexuality was considered sacred, particularly within marriage. It was governed by rules, yes, but not repressed. A husband and wife were expected to know each other, not merely physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and ritually. Pregnancy was encouraged, and motherhood revered. A woman who died in childbirth was honored with the same rights as a fallen warrior. Her soul joined the sun in its zenith, riding the sky for eternity. Her name was spoken in hushed reverence. Still, not every marriage was a success. Some unions faltered. Laziness, abuse, infertility, or simple incompatibility could lead to divorce, a process that, while not common, was respected. A couple seeking separation would appear before elders and explain their reasons. If the court deemed them legitimate, the wife returned to her parents with her belongings, and both were free to remarry. Children were usually assigned to the father. Assets were divided according to custom. And most surprising of all, there was little stigma. Life was hard. Marriage, like agriculture, required balance. Not every crop took root. So how did love develop in this system? Slowly, through ritual and repetition. A husband rising early to prepare a tall maize drink for his wife. A wife weaving her husband's name into the border of a blanket. These were not dramatic gestures. They were steady, meaningful acts. A kind of love that grew quietly like corn in the dark earth, reliant not on thunder, but on time. Stories were passed down of couples who aged together so gracefully that even the gods took notice. One tale tells of an old woman who combed her husband's hair each night until he died, and then did it still combing the space where he used to sit. So what happened when the Spanish came? When swords met feathers, and the pate gave way to the crucifix? How did the rituals survive, if they survived at all? When Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors arrived in 1519, they did not come gently. They brought with them steel, horses, and a theology forged in fire. The Aztec Empire, complex, ritualized, and steeped in cycles of harmony, was bewildering to the Europeans. Its temples shocked them, its gods unsettled them, and its customs, particularly surrounding marriage and intimacy, confused them. To the Aztecs, marriage was practical and sacred. To the Spanish, it was sacramental and hierarchical, and in that clash, something quiet began to unravel. The intimate threads of a culture where even love had its ceremony. At first, the Spanish made little effort to understand the marriage customs of the Aztecs. They assumed their own way was superior. The idea of couples being joined by matchmakers, bound by tunics, and blessed by a goddess like Xochiquetzal was to them pagan, even demonic. Priests and missionaries quickly sought to replace native practices with Catholic rites. The Spanish ceremony emphasized monogamy, male authority, and the Christian sacrament of marriage, ideas that did not necessarily align with Nahua Aztec beliefs, where gender roles had more balance and separation or remarriage was allowed under certain circumstances. The Spanish insisted that a marriage could only be valid if conducted by a Christian priest, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A shared fire, no matter how lovingly tended, meant nothing to them. The indigenous marriage ceremonies were not outlawed overnight, but they were systematically dismantled. The Secuatlnacazque, the elderly matchmakers, were denounced as witches. The sacred calendars used to determine compatibility were banned. The feathered mats were replaced by wooden beds, and the 5-day trial period was deemed immoral. Divorce was declared sinful. Women who attempted to return to their families were now called adulteresses, not seekers of balance. And yet, not all was erased. In the rural valleys away from the gaze of Spanish authorities, old customs lingered. Families still consulted elders. Birth dates were whispered. Braids were tied on wedding nights, and fires were lit under silent prayers, not to saints but to memories. A man might still offer his bride's father a cloak and a bowl of cacao, even if the priest demanded rings and candles. But more than the ceremonies, it was the philosophy of marriage that suffered under conquest. In Aztec tradition, a marriage was a partnership, and though not always equal in labor, it was mutual in expectation. Husbands were advised to listen to their wives. Wives were trained to speak firmly and wisely. Advice was given in proverbs. A good husband builds the hearth, but a good wife feeds it. Under colonial influence, this balance shifted. Spanish sermons emphasized obedience and hierarchy. Women were increasingly portrayed as subordinate. Virginity, once respected but not obsessive in Aztec life, became a moral obsession under Catholic rule. The previously accepted concept of divorce was wiped away. What followed was a long, slow blurring of customs. In many cases, indigenous people adapted Catholic rituals outwardly, while continuing traditional practices in private. A couple might be married in a church, but still retreat afterward to sit on a reed mat in their home, fingers intertwined, offering thanks to the household gods whose names they no longer spoke aloud. The language of marriage changed too. Nahuatl, the Aztec tongue, remained widely spoken for centuries. But in matters of law and religion, Spanish became the official voice. As a result, old marriage terms vanished. The beautiful phrase "yanquic ikipoctli," new maiden used for brides, was replaced with esposa, a word linked to servitude and binding. And yet the old world lingered in quiet ways. In certain villages, blankets still played a central role in weddings, a remnant of the Peto tradition. A couple might kneel upon one, or be wrapped in a shawl together, signs of union older than the crucifix. In some households, the ashes from the first shared fire were kept in a clay pot, hidden behind the hearth. Even the idea of shared labor, so central to Aztec marital life, survived. Though colonial gender roles sought to separate male and female duties, many couples continued to work side by side in markets, fields, and kitchens. A man who refused to help grind maize even in the colonial period, might still be scolded by his mother as half a husband, and the feathered beds, gone, mostly. Feathers, especially the sacred Quetzal plumes, became rare under colonial trade laws. Those that remained were used for church vestments or taxed heavily. But the idea of softness, of marriage as a resting place rather than a battlefield, remained. Some couples passed down embroidered cushions or inherited reed mats, old and frayed, kept more for memory than comfort. Among the saddest losses was the freedom of divorce. Without this cultural outlet, many Aztec-descended women suffered silently in abusive or incompatible marriages. Caught between two worlds, Catholic confession offered some relief, but rarely solutions. Still, stories endured. An old folktale from the Highlands tells of a woman named Tessie Whattle, who fled her harsh husband one stormy night. Carrying only her marriage mat and a burning ember from their hearth, she walked to the edge of the world, they say, and lit a new fire beside the stars. Some say this is why Venus burns so brightly at dawn, the fire of a woman who would not stay in silence. Whether legend or longing, these stories kept the soul of Aztec marriage alive long after the conquerors claimed to have erased it. So what happens when love is colonized, when rituals are repurposed, and sacred words are replaced with foreign prayers? Does the old warmth still flicker under the ashes? And when couples today speak their vows on blankets in churches beneath arches of marigolds, are they speaking to the present alone? Or are they answering a voice from a time when love meant a shared hearth, a tied knot, and a silence filled with smoke and meaning? Today, in the valleys of central Mexico, along the pathways once walked by priests of Quetzalcoatl, and across the marketplaces where reed mats were traded like precious gold, something remarkable is happening. People are remembering. Not everything, not perfectly, not through dusty scrolls or dramatic ceremonies, but in threads, phrases, habits, small echoes of the marriage customs once at the heart of the Aztec world. You might not recognize it at first glance. A young couple standing before a civil registrar, a Catholic priest delivering blessings beneath a white arch, mariachi music in the background, a white dress, a tiered cake, all symbols of modernity, Western influence and Catholic ritual. And yet, look closely. Notice the grandmother slipping a woven sash around the couple's shoulders, binding them at the chest. Listen to the mother whispering Nahuatl words over a bowl of steaming tamales, placed carefully beside the hearth the night before. Watch the children scatter marigold petals just as they did in temple rites centuries ago. These are not just gestures, they are acts of cultural survival. Over the last century, indigenous communities across Mexico have begun to reclaim pieces of their heritage, including the marriage rituals once dismissed or banned under colonial law. It began with scholars, artists, and midwives. Then it spread to community leaders, educators, young people hungry for something deeper than white lace and canned vows. In some villages, couples now choose to hold dual ceremonies, one Catholic, one indigenous. In the indigenous ritual, elders lead the proceedings, often in open-air courtyards. A petate or reed mat is still used. The couple kneels upon it as incense is burned, echoing the sacred fires once tended in Aztec homes. Instead of rings, some exchange wool bracelets, knotted 3 times. Instead of wine, chocolate or maize beer is sipped from a shared cup. And instead of a priest's sermon, the elder tells a story, perhaps the tale of Capacli and the earth's creation, or of a woman who braided her husband's name into every corner of their house, unseen but never unwoven. The symbolism is old, but the meaning, still new, still growing. There are even modern marriage contracts, written in both Spanish and Nahuatl, used in some traditional ceremonies. They outline duties not in legalese, but in poetry. You will rise before the sun to heat the stones of our day. You will sweep the path of my sadness. You will bring maize and I will grind it into mourning. No mention of ownership, no talk of hierarchy, just a mutual exchange of labor, of ritual, of care. Young people, too, are finding ways to merge the ancient and the present. Some couples compose vows in the structure of old flower songs, the lyric form once sung by Nahuatl poets. Others include feathers now ethically sourced or symbolic, woven into headbands or sewn into cuffs. A few even reintroduce the 5-day abstinence period after marriage, not as penance but as mindfulness, a space to shift from ceremony into daily life. And the question arises again, what is marriage really? In the Aztec tradition, it was always more than a contract. It was an agreement to build a household, to share a fire, and to balance work and pleasure, sun and shadow. This philosophy, though reworded and repackaged, has reappeared in modern ideas of co-parenting, domestic equity, and emotional partnership. Academics have noted that some feminist movements in Latin America look back to pre-Columbian marriage models, as inspiration for more balanced domestic roles, not as a return to the past, but as proof that other frameworks once existed and could again. But the revival is not without resistance. In some communities, the Catholic Church still discourages indigenous rituals, warning against syncretism. There are debates in city offices over the legal recognition of traditional marriages. Elders worry that young people romanticize the past without understanding its depth. And there is always the risk of commodification, of turning sacred rites into staged performances for tourists. Still, the movement continues. Why? Because in a world where relationships often feel transactional, where marriage is burdened by legal battles and economic strain, the simplicity of the Aztec view offers comfort. You carry water, I grind corn, we share the fire, that is enough. It's a vision rooted in daily life, not just ceremony, in what happens after the feast is over, in whether the mat is rolled up together, in whether the hearth is tended when no one is watching, and in that vision, the feathered bed returns, not in plumes but in softness. Softness in waking someone before the sun to offer them warm atoll. Softness in remembering which flowers they braided into their hair last year. Softness in stepping over the mat quietly while they sleep. In these gestures, the old vows live again. So yes, much was lost. The temples, the calendars, the goddess names, but the marriage customs of the Aztecs never truly vanished. They were woven into blankets, whispered into recipes, pressed into clay bowls, and now they are being rewoven. A couple today, lighting a candle together before bed, might not know that they echo 1,000 years of ritual, but the fire remembers, and as long as people continue to tie knots, to share cups, to sweep paths together, then somewhere, deep beneath the stone of modern life, the potato still waits. Imagine the air damp, cold and thick with the scent of beeswax, ink and unwashed wool. Stone walls sweat in the chill of a cloistered scriptorium. Somewhere a bell is tolling, matins perhaps, or maybe lauds. Either way, you rise from your straw-filled mattress, straighten your robe and begin another day as a monk in medieval Europe. You are supposed to think only of God, but your body has other ideas. This is the world of monastic lust, not in the sense of indulgence, but in the sense of vigilant denial. The monasteries of the 11th to 14th centuries were places of prayer, discipline, and strict routine. But beneath the silence and the scripture, many monks lived in a state of private, uneasy battle with desire. Let's begin with the rules. Monastic orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and later the Carthusians laid down rigid expectations for bodily conduct. Celibacy was not only required, it was treated as a form of sacred warfare, a daily test of spiritual resolve. Every bodily urge, especially sexual desire, was considered a threat to purity, a crack through which the devil might slip. And so monks developed systems of watchfulness. They did not sleep alone. Dormitories held rows of straw pallets, sometimes with as many as 30 monks to a hall. They wore woolen undergarments even in summer, to dull the senses. Baths were rare and cold, just enough to clean, never to indulge. Even eye contact could be suspect. Young novices were warned against looking too long at each other, or at visitors. During readings, they kept their eyes on the page. During meals, their heads stayed bowed. Speech was limited, silence was a shield. And yet, despite all these precautions, lust persisted, because it is not so easily dismissed. Many monks confessed in private and in writing to erotic dreams, unwanted arousals, even moments of temptation during the most mundane chores. One 13th century monk, writing anonymously in Latin, recorded, "I saw her only as she handed me bread, and still my hands were not clean for hours." The guilt was overwhelming, but what's truly fascinating is how the monasteries recorded these sins, not with scandal but with methodical calm. Every monastery had a confessor, a monk tasked with hearing the private sins of his brothers. These confessions were not always spontaneous. In some communities, monks were expected to confess weekly, or even daily, regardless of whether they believed they had sinned. And what did they confess? Everything. "I dreamed of my mother's kitchen and awoke in shame. I looked at Brother Matthew's neck longer than I should have. I walked through the orchard and thought of Eve." These confessions were often written down, either by the monk himself or the confessor, using coded Latin phrases. Lustful dreams were labelled somnia nocturna, night dreams, often with qualifiers like impura or turpia, impure or shameful. Touching oneself even during sleep was a grave concern. Repeated offences led to fasting, increased prayer hours, and sometimes public penance. One monk caught twice in a month, confessing sins of the flesh, was ordered to sleep on the chapel floor for a fortnight without a blanket, beside the altar reciting psalms until dawn. But not all monasteries were so harsh. Some, especially those influenced by Cassardian moderation, recognized that lust was part of human nature. They advised patience, humility, and daily recommitment. One abbey in Burgundy instructed its novices, "When the body burns, place your feet in cold water, then read the Song of Songs not aloud." And here lies one of the strangest contradictions of monastic life. While monks were forbidden to think or speak of sensuality, they spent hours illuminating manuscripts that contained it. The Song of Songs, a biblical text brimming with erotic metaphor, was one of the most copied books in medieval monasteries. Phrases like, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth," were transcribed by candlelight, often with intricate illustrations, vines, pomegranates, even semi-clothed figures rendered in gold leaf. Were these decorations devotional? Certainly. But were they also outlets, perhaps? The margins of some monastic manuscripts contain tiny doodles, rabbits mating, nuns with suggestive vegetables, monks chasing wild women. These weren't official. They were marginalia, humorous, subversive, often hidden. Some scholars believe these drawings were not expressions of sin, but of containment, ways to acknowledge desire while keeping it safely tucked away in the corner. Music, too, carried hidden emotion. While Gregorian chants were restrained and sacred, their slow melodies sometimes became a kind of emotional conduit, especially during long night vigils. A monk might sing of divine longing, while quietly redirecting his personal hunger into the soaring Latin syllables. Cor meum ardens est, my heart is burning. Was it for God, or for something he could never name? And so we begin to understand, monastic life was not a realm of angels. It was a slow, disciplined negotiation with humanity, a place where men, seeking holiness, found themselves haunted by their own bodies. So what happens when discipline fails? When a glance lingers too long? When the fire no longer burns just for God? The bells toll again. This time for prime, the first daylight office of the monastic day. The dormitory is emptying, sandals scraping softly across stone. You shuffle into the chapel with your brethren, eyes lowered, lips murmuring psalms. No one speaks of what happened during the night. No one dares to ask, but the silence is filled with meaning. In medieval monasteries, the punishment for lust was rarely theatrical. It was not designed to humiliate, but to purify, to discipline, and most importantly, to restore order. The goal was not to banish the sinner, but to bring him back into rhythm with the community and with God. Let us examine how that was done. Most punishments began in private: extended fasts, additional prayer duties, cold baths, or loss of privileges. A monk who confessed impure thoughts might be assigned more hours in the garden, or scriptorium tasks designed to focus the mind and exhaust the body. But if the offense was repeated, or discovered rather than confessed, the consequences were public. At the chapter meeting, a daily gathering where each monk sat on a stone bench and confessed faults, offenders might kneel at the centre of the room, while the abbot listed their transgressions in plain Latin. No euphemisms, no escape. Freda Thomas dormivit mali, nocte tertia, manibus suis. Brother Thomas slept poorly for a third night with his hands. He would then be ordered to stand in the refectory while others ate, or to prostrate himself during Mass, arms stretched wide like a crucifix. These gestures were not just punishment, they were reminders to the community. Lust lives here, and it must be fought. Some monks bore these trials with humility, others suffered in silence, and a few wrote. Indeed, one of the most intriguing windows into monastic desire comes not from confessional records, but from personal notebooks, small, hand-bound volumes monks kept tucked in their robes. Many survive today, fragile but legible, filled with scribbled prayers, marginal drawings, and between the lines, confessions far more human than holy. Consider this entry from a 14th century English monk, written in cramped Latin shorthand. "Last night I dreamed of warmth, not flame. A mouth spoke my name. I awoke with shame, but also with longing. I fear both." This was not the language of rebellion. It was the language of struggle, careful, coded, but unmistakably emotional. These monks weren't indulging in lust. They were documenting it, naming it, offering it up like incense in hopes it would dissipate. Some went further, turning to manuals of penance, books like the Penitential of Camina or the Decretum of Burchard of Worms, which listed hundreds of sins along with appropriate punishments. For example, if a monk touches himself with lustful intent, he shall fast on bread and water for 7 days. If he looks with desire upon another monk, he shall chant 150 psalms at night, standing, without leaning. These were not hypothetical. They were administered with precision. One Cistercian abbey in France kept a disciplinary ledger where such sentences were recorded, along with dates of completion. Names were not always included, but initials often were. The goal was both privacy and accountability. Of course, not all sin was equal. There were whispered stories of monks who formed deep emotional attachments, sometimes with fellow monks, sometimes with lay brothers, or even with visiting pilgrims. These bonds, when discovered, were treated with seriousness, not because of romantic scandal, but because they disrupted the balance of monastic life. A monk's love, in theory, belonged to God alone. To transfer that affection to another human, no matter how chaste, was a breach of monastic focus. And yet, how could one avoid affection? They lived together, worked together, prayed together. They shared meals, secrets, and the aching quiet of long nights. In such an environment, even friendship could be suspect. And love, even the silent kind, was always a risk. Some monasteries addressed this with stricter physical boundaries. In Cluniac houses, monks were forbidden from speaking outside designated hours. In Carthusian orders, they lived in near total isolation, each with his own cell and garden. Meals were passed through small windows, faces unseen. These reforms were not anti-human, they were desperate acts of spiritual preservation. But desire finds forms, and so it bled into poetry, into song, and especially into illumination. Take the Luttrell Psalter, a 14th century English manuscript. Its margins are filled with fantastical images, hybrid beasts, musical frogs, and yes, monks engaging in comic or suggestive behavior, a monk chasing a pig, a nun wielding a phallic spindle, a fox in clerical robes preaching to geese. These images weren't doctrinal, they were emotional safety valves, etched by scribes who perhaps needed to laugh at the very rules they followed. And in that laughter we find humanity, not rebellion, but release. In rare cases, a monk might leave the order, unable to reconcile his body with his vows. Some were expelled, others ran. A few found new vocations as healers, poets, or tutors. The church usually erased their names, but in local records they appear, mysterious figures with ink-stained fingers and quiet smiles. And still the monasteries carried on. For centuries they held fast to silence, prayer, and ritual denial. The sins of lust were fought, confessed, punished, and fought again. No one ever claimed victory. That wasn't the point. The point was the struggle. Because in that struggle, monks believed, lay holiness. But was holiness truly born from suppression, or could it be found in understanding? And when the ink dried on another page, and the candle guttered low, did the monk feel relief, or just the return of a battle he would fight again tomorrow? Let us sit one last time in that candlelit chamber. A monk is writing. His fingers are ink-stained, his robes coarse against his skin. Outside, a rain drizzles gently against the cloister's stone arches. Somewhere beyond, the world continues. Markets bustling, children shouting, fires crackling in hearths. But here, inside the walls of the monastery, time is measured not by seasons but by prayer bells. And somewhere desire still stirs beneath the wool. The final chapter of this story is not about punishment or purity, but about endurance and what remains after centuries of whispered struggle. By the late medieval period, around the 15th century, the monastic fight against lust had become so ritualized, so thoroughly recorded, that it left behind a strange and often poignant archive, a window into what it means to resist the self and to chronicle it, line by trembling line. Many monks never broke their vows, not out of ignorance or repression, but because they built lives of containment, not denial, but transformation. One abbey in Flanders taught that sexual desire was like a wild dog. You cannot kill it, but you can train it to sit by the door. The methods of this training evolved. In some houses, monks were taught meditative redirection. When lustful thoughts came, they were to imagine themselves buried in earth, cradled by the silence of death, or purified in divine light. Others turned to manual labor, treating the garden or the forge not just as chores but as acts of self-discipline. A monk tending onions might whisper psalms as his hands moved, grounding himself in rhythm rather than reverie. And then there were those who rechanneled desire into art, the tradition of illuminated initials, those ornate blooming letters that begin medieval texts, often served as a hidden outlet. A monk might spend days decorating the letter A with vines, animals, and human forms. The sensuality was abstract, symbolic, but undeniable. It was not lewd, it was sacred through sublimation. In this way, many monks found a kind of spiritual release, not by erasing desire, but by elevating it. And what of their legacy? When the Reformation swept through Europe, many monasteries were dissolved, their libraries scattered, their gardens overgrown. Reformers criticized the cloistered life as unnatural, corrupt, and sexually suspicious. Some burned confessional records, others mocked the idea of celibacy altogether. But the monks themselves, those quiet figures, left behind something far more nuanced than sermons or scandal. They left behind journals, psalters, herbals, and books of hours filled with traces of the struggle between flesh and spirit. Some writings are deeply moving, not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. One 15th century monk in Wales, known only by the initials RM, wrote this in the final pages of his Psalter. "I feared my thoughts for 50 years. Now I let them sit beside me like old dogs. They bark less. I feed them psalms." What do we learn from such a life? That celibacy, for these men, was not simply abstention. It was a vocation of watching the body, the mind, the soul, not to punish, but to understand. Their failures were not shameful. They were expected to confess, was not to collapse. It was to continue, and continue they did. Through wars, famine, plague, and reform, monastic houses persisted, and even in modern times, some still do. Monks today, though fewer in number, still live lives of celibacy, prayer, and quiet labor. Their relationship to lust may be less fear-driven, more psychologically informed, but the discipline of attention remains. Even outside the cloister, the echo of this tradition lingers. When you feel desire and sit with it, observe it without acting, that's monastic. When you write about your struggle, not to be seen but to understand, that's monastic. When you light a candle and close your eyes, not to summon something, but to still the noise, that too is monastic. The cloister is not just a place, it is a posture, a way of noticing the tension between who we are and who we hope to be. And in that gap, the medieval monk still kneels. He is no longer bound by Latin, no longer ruled by abbots, but his quiet war with longing, his careful recording of weakness, his endless returning to the fold, those live on. So the next time you feel conflicted, torn between want and will, perhaps remember this. 1,000 years ago, in a damp, echoing stone room, someone just like you was dipping his quill into ink, whispering a prayer, and writing down the truth of his desire, not to hide it, but to hold it gently beneath the gaze of something greater. And for him, that was enough. The lanterns have just been lit. Soft, diffused light glows through rice paper doors, casting shadows of cherry blossoms on silk screens. The scent of sandalwood curls through the alleyways. Somewhere in the distance, a 3-stringed shamisen begins to hum. You are walking now through Yoshiwara, the licensed pleasure district of Edo period Japan. It is the 18th century. The shogunate governs the land with strict codes, rigid hierarchies, and controlled rituals. But here, behind curved fans and sliding doors, another code rules. The delicate, measured, and deeply complex world of the courtesan. Let us set the stage. Yoshiwara was not a back-alley affair. It was a purpose-built, officially sanctioned walled district designed for regulated desire. Situated on the outskirts of old Edo, modern-day Tokyo, it was an entire city within a city, complete with its own architecture, seasons, customs, and social expectations. Its cobbled paths were patrolled by lantern-bearing guides. Its tea-houses were finely appointed, and at its heart were the oiran, the highest-ranking courtesans in Japan, but do not mistake them for mere entertainers. The oiran were cultural elites, trained from childhood, not only in the arts of seduction, but in poetry, dance, music, calligraphy, conversation, fashion, and psychology. Their role was not to offer their body, at least not quickly, but to offer an experience, stylized, elusive, and highly choreographed. If marriage in the samurai world was a matter of alliance, the courtesan's world was one of performance and persuasion. To even see an oiran was a privilege. Visitors to Yoshiwara had to pass through rituals of etiquette just to request an introduction. One did not simply choose a courtesan. One petitioned, through intermediaries and tea-house hosts. The oiran could refuse or delay for days, even weeks. Her power rested in her ability to withhold, and so began the game. It was a slow dance of fans and phrases. A client might send gifts, calligraphy ink from Kyoto, a bolt of rare silk, or a poem written in flowing kana. She might respond with a riddle, or a rejection wrapped in a haiku. The goal was not conquest, but cultivation. And what of the courtesans themselves? Most began their lives in hardship. Many were sold into the pleasure houses as children, under contracts that bound them for years, sometimes decades. The highest-ranking oiran were exceptions, educated, revered, and sometimes able to buy their freedom. But even they lived behind the silken walls of Yoshiwara, both idolized and imprisoned. Their day began not with leisure, but with ritual preparation. Hair was styled for hours using lacquer, pins, and combs, so heavy they could cause neck strain. Layers of kimono were selected not only for their color, but their seasonal appropriateness, their symbolism, and their subtle messages. The outermost robe might show chrysanthemums in autumn, plum blossoms in winter, or water wheels in spring, each communicating an emotion or intent. Makeup was applied in silence, a base of white powder, red lips shaped like a bow, and eyebrows plucked and redrawn in delicate arcs. This transformation was not vanity, it was armor. By late afternoon, the Oiran would emerge, not walking, but gliding, in 6-inch platform sandals called komageta, flanked by attendants. This was the Oiran Dochu, the ceremonial procession. She moved slowly, regally, commanding attention. It was a performance of presence, seen by hundreds, but available to none. And behind the doors, conversations began with incense, tea, and literary games. A favoured courtesan might test a client's intelligence with poetry riddles, or quote classical texts. If he failed to keep up, the mood soured. If he succeeded, she might smile behind her fan, just slightly. Intimacy, when it occurred, was rare and expensive. Contracts were strict. A night with an Oiran might cost a year's salary for a merchant, and it was never immediate. Most clients spent weeks earning the right. The first night they might only speak. The second, sit in silence. The third, if granted, might offer a shared drink. Touch came only when the courtesan chose. But what did that choice mean? For many, it meant little more than strategy. Choosing a wealthy patron could mean better lodging, lighter duties, even a path to manumission. For others, especially those who stayed long in the district, affection grew quietly. The courtesan's journal, if she kept one, might contain phrases like, "He brought plum wine and did not speak of himself once. I rested my eyes," or "He quoted Basho poorly, but he tried. I let him pour the tea." Still, emotional entanglement was dangerous. A courtesan in love risked everything. If her feelings interfered with earnings, her house mistress could reassign her. If she offended a patron, she could be punished or sent to lesser quarters. In extreme cases, she could be sold again, and yet stories survive. A well-known tale speaks of an Oiran named Takao, beloved by a daimyo warlord who offered to buy her freedom. She refused, not out of pride, but because she loved another, a younger man, poor and quiet. The daimyo, enraged, drowned her in a river. Her grave still stands today, and pilgrims leave fans and poems in her honor. In another case, a courtesan named Hanabusa vanished after her contract ended. Some say she married a poet, others say she became a nun. But decades later, a poem appeared in a Kyoto anthology, signed with her old crest. "I wore their seasons like robes, now I wear wind, and answer to no one." These stories may be half myth, but they reveal a truth, that beneath the painted faces and elaborate rituals were women of great intellect, restraint, and feeling. And while the samurai world outside saw intimacy as duty, the courtesan's world transformed it into art. A glance, a line of ink, a bowl of tea, slightly tilted. But what happens when a life of performance becomes indistinguishable from the self? And when the seasons turn, when the client leaves, or the house grows quiet? What remains of the woman who once wore fans like armor and made poetry her only form of defense? The paper is thick and soft, made from mulberry bark and water. It carries the faint scent of chrysanthemum ink, pressed into its fibers with brush strokes that curve like wind over reeds. Across the top, in delicate script, is the title, Night Agreement. This is not a love letter. It is a contract, binding, precise, and marked with the red seal of a house mistress. The name of the courtesan is written formally, without embellishment. The client's name follows, along with the expected time of arrival, the number of servants permitted to accompany him, and the specific room assigned for the encounter. A night with a high-ranking courtesan of the Yoshiwara, especially an Oiran, was not spontaneous. It was arranged like a piece of ceremonial theatre, built upon centuries of ritual and commercial structure. Let's take a closer look at how that theatre unfolded. Yoshiwara operated under a strict hierarchy. At the top were the Taiyu and Oiran, women of elite status who could command prices that exceeded what many samurai earned in a year. Below them were Koshi, Sukamawashi, and finally the Shinzo, apprentices in training. Each level had its own scheduled duties and freedoms, or lack thereof. An Oiran might see only a few clients per month, not because she lacked popularity, but because her availability was limited by ritual. Each visit had to be prepared, the room cleaned and perfumed with burning aloes, the courtesan's attire selected to match the season and the guest's personality, and the food tailored to known preferences. She did not merely receive a guest, she staged his experience like a play, but none of it was truly hers. The courtesan did not own her clothing, nor her room, nor even the ink she used to write reply poems. All belonged to the pleasure house, a business operated by powerful women known as yarite. The house mistress controlled schedules, approved gifts, oversaw contracts, and enforced discipline. She was both employer and warden, responsible for collecting debts, maintaining decorum, and ensuring that no courtesan became too soft. Most courtesans had been sold into their houses as children, usually between the ages of 7 and 10. Their contracts could last 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. They were taught everything: how to pour tea, how to fold letters, how to compose waka poetry with subtle longing but no clear desire. Their handwriting was scrutinized more than their faces. Those who excelled rose through the ranks, but even the most successful courtesan owed debts for her robes, her hairpieces, her musical instruments, her room. These debts were recorded meticulously in the house books. A courtesan might work for decades and still be told she owed money, and yet some found ways to navigate the system. Occasionally, a wealthy patron would buy out a courtesan's contract, freeing her to marry or retire. These cases were rare and often romanticized. The reality was more complicated. A courtesan who accepted release had to choose: enter a respectable marriage, usually with her patron, or face a world that distrusted her past. Some chose a third path. A small number of retired courtesans became teachers of the arts, opening schools for calligraphy, dance, or poetry. Others became mistresses of pleasure houses themselves, wielding the same ledgers that once ruled their lives. A few wrote memoirs, though these were often disguised as fiction or published anonymously. One such memoir, The Mirror of Mist and Fans, is attributed to a former Oiran named Tsukiko. In it, she writes, "He said I was a flower in a locked garden, but flowers do not choose the soil. They grow. That is enough." Back in Yoshiwara, for those still bound to the system, each night was a performance, and not always an easy one. Clients were not always gentle or intelligent. Some were crude, others arrogant, and a few dangerous. A courtesan had little power to refuse once a contract was signed. If a guest drank too much, grew aggressive, or treated her with contempt, she endured in silence, offering poetry where anger wanted to rise. And yet some used the contract itself as defense. An Oiran could write a clause into her agreement, a prohibition against drunkenness, a limitation on physical contact, or a condition that the guest bring a specific gift or poem. If these were violated, she could claim breach of contract and withdraw without penalty. This was not common, but it happened. These quiet legal strategies became an art form of their own, a choreography of ink, as much as of movement or mood. The house mistress often assisted in writing these clauses, using her experience to phrase them in polite but firm terms. What emerges is a picture of women navigating an impossible system with impossible grace. They lived behind walls, walked in shoes that crippled them, wore wigs that tore at their scalps, and smiled when smiling was required. And through it all they composed, calculated, and carved out moments of selfhood. Their letters survive, hundreds of them, preserved in museum archives, family shrines, and dusty temple boxes. Some are formal, others personal. A few are stunningly raw, from an Oiran to a client who failed to return. "You said my silence was deeper than snow, then why fear its cold?" From a courtesan to her younger sister, still in training. "They will teach you to bow but not to rise, teach yourself." And from a woman writing to no one on her final night in the house, "I have folded fans, sipped wine, played shamisen. I have become what they asked. Tomorrow I will wash my own face." These were not declarations of rebellion, they were acknowledgements of survival. So what was love in such a place? It came quietly, in the form of shared ink, or a look held slightly too long. It came in letters rewritten a dozen times, never sent. It came when a courtesan offered a poem, not because it was required, but because she meant it. And in those rare moments when performance fell away and feeling remained, the ink did not stain, it sang. But what happened when Yoshiwara itself began to change? When the world outside its walls began to modernize, and the courtesans once admired were slowly replaced by new entertainment, new voices, new desires. The streets are still paved with stone, the lanterns still flicker in the mist, but something has changed. It is the late 19th century, and the world outside Yoshiwara is moving faster. Steam engines cry across the land, Western suits appear where kimonos once ruled. Telegrams hum, the Meiji Restoration has begun, and with it comes a quiet unraveling of the centuries-old world of the courtesan. Yoshiwara, once a jewel of ritualized romance and delicate hierarchy, is beginning its final performance. The decline did not come all at once. In fact, for a time, Yoshiwara flourished, even as Japan modernized. Foreign diplomats visiting Tokyo often sought entrance to the pleasure district, their curiosity mixing poorly with limited cultural understanding. Some left with tales of enchantment. Others reduced the courtesans to caricatures, exotic, tragic, mysterious. But inside the walls, the women knew, the world was shifting. The state began to view licensed prostitution less as an art and more as a problem. Medical inspectors were introduced, supposedly to prevent disease, but inspections were invasive, humiliating, and often wielded as tools of control. Contracts became tighter, freedoms fewer, and perhaps most painful of all, the hierarchy collapsed. The refined elite status of the Oran was gradually replaced by the rise of the geisha, who represented a different kind of performer, musical, witty, artistic, but not sexual in contract. While geisha had long existed outside Yoshiwara, they began to eclipse the courtesans in the public imagination. Geisha entertained, Oran sold access. In a society trying to appear modern to Western observers, the former was more acceptable. Many courtesans, unable to compete with changing tastes, were demoted or dismissed. Others, fearing obsolescence, transitioned into tea-house workers or servants. Some tried to become geisha themselves, but their training, rooted in seduction and ritual, didn't always transfer cleanly, and yet even as the system faded, the artistry endured. Retired Oran, especially those who had bought their freedom, opened schools for poetry, dance and etiquette. They became keepers of culture, passing down the performance of presence to a generation no longer bound by house contracts. One such figure was Shinobu, who established a modest writing school on the outskirts of Tokyo. She accepted only girls, taught them to read both Chinese characters and kana, and insisted on daily journaling. In one surviving lesson she writes, "Never write your name in haste, it is a brushstroke of your existence." Her students called her sensei. They never knew her former name. The Oiran also found echoes in literature. Writers of the Meiji and Taisho eras romanticized the courtesan's world, painting it in nostalgic tones, sometimes accurate, often idealized. Novels like The River Keik and Snow Country contain shadows of Yoshiwara, the careful etiquette, the performative poise, the hidden sorrow. But these works often filtered the courtesan through a male lens, turning complex women into tragic muses. Real courtesans rarely had the last word, but some tried. In 1902, a collection of anonymous poems appeared under the title Fans Without Wind. Scholars believe at least a dozen former Oiran contributed to the volume. The poems are simple, clear, and deeply intimate. They taught me to pour tea. No one taught me what to do when the cup is empty. He said my silence was beauty. I kept it so long, I forgot my voice. These were not performances, they were acts of reclamation. By the early 20th century, Yoshiwara still existed, but only in structure. The walls were there, but the culture inside had thinned. World War II accelerated the collapse. Air raids in 1945 destroyed much of the district. After the war, the Allied occupation outlawed licensed prostitution entirely. Yoshiwara was dismantled in name and law, and yet, like perfume on old silk, the memory lingered. Today, the district where Yoshiwara once stood is simply part of Tokyo. Its name is barely spoken. A few museums hold its artifacts: shoes too high to walk in, letters on faded paper, combs wrapped in tissue. Scholars pore over these pieces, trying to reconstruct a world that was never meant to be permanent. But the legacy of the courtesan, especially the Oran, lives on in subtle ways. In Japan, traditional wedding processions sometimes imitate the Oran dorchu, with the bride elevated, robed in red, walking slowly beneath a parasol. In certain kabuki plays, the Oran story is dramatized, not as a tale of tragedy, but of power wrapped in patience. Some young women, interested in cultural preservation, train in Oran walk for festivals, not as performers of the old profession, but as guardians of its artistry. And among calligraphers, the Oiran style of script, elegant, looping, intensely personal, is still taught. It is not practical, it is not fast, but it is graceful, and its strokes carry more than ink. They carry presence, because that, above all, was the courtesan's gift, to make herself seen, not fully, not plainly, but with precision. To move through a room like a poem, to speak through fans, to shape silence into seduction. And in that, she was not only a performer, she was a creator of space. So what is left now? A few documents, a few memories, some shoes in a glass case, and perhaps in the quiet moments of someone painting their lips in a mirror, or folding a letter slowly by hand, a faint echo of a woman who once ruled the night through gesture, ink, and the gentle refusal to be rushed. She is gone, but her form remains. Paris, the 17th century. Beneath the chiming bells of Notre Dame and the gasps of powdered courtiers, another rhythm hums quietly beneath the cobblestones. It is the sound of coin, of whispers, and of state-sanctioned indulgence. In the world of Louis XIV and his successors, love may have been whispered in salons and danced around in ballrooms, but sex, especially bought sex, was taxed, licensed, recorded, and policed. This is the story of how the French monarchy transformed desire into revenue. turning the most private of acts into a bureaucratic commodity. Let us begin not in a brothel, but in an office. Somewhere near the Place Dauphine, an official sits behind a desk. Before him is a large leather-bound register. Each page is ruled in neat columns: name, address, physical description, and license number. This is not a census. It is a government registry of sex workers, known as filles publiques, who were legally permitted to operate in designated neighborhoods of Paris. Each one paid a fee. Each one was taxed. The origins of this system stretch back to the Middle Ages, but it was under the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, that the regulation of prostitution became institutionalized. The logic was straightforward. Sex work wasn't going away, so why not organize it, monetize it, control it, and above all, profit from it? Thus emerged the Maison de Tolerance, literally houses of tolerance. These were government-approved brothels, each operating under a set of regulations issued by local police commissioners. They were required to pay annual fees and bribes, formerly inspection fees, register all employees with physical descriptions and aliases, RONs, keep medical records, especially after the rise of syphilis, RON report unruly clients or violence, maintain moral decorum in public-facing areas. In return, they were protected, or at least tolerated. And the revenue, it poured in. Estimates suggest that in certain Parisian quarters, brothel licensing fees contributed thousands of livres annually to the royal treasury, enough to fund portions of city maintenance or supplement military logistics. In provincial towns, the system was even more blatant. Tax collectors were assigned to brothel districts, and weekly audits were expected. The sex tax became so normalized that entire financial categories were built around it. Town ledgers from Lyon and Marseille list income under headings like Femme d'agrément permis royal, women of pleasure, royal permit. But how did it work on the ground? A woman entering the trade had two choices: operate legally through a licensed house, or work on the margin as an unregistered streetwalker. The latter was dangerous, punishable by fines, imprisonment, or even forced labor, but for many, especially the poor, it was the only option. Those who chose the legal path were examined, not just medically, but bureaucratically. Officials recorded hair color, height, distinguishing features, and even preferred clothing. They were issued licenses, stamped with the fleur-de-lis, which had to be renewed regularly. One surviving license reads, Françoise D., age 24, auburn hair, tall, known to reside in Rue du Temple, authorized to conduct private visits between the hours of sundown and cockcrow, except on feast days. License expires midsummer. In effect, these women became employees of the state, with all the burden that entailed, but none of the benefits. They paid fees, they submitted to inspection, but they received no protection against poverty, illness, or violence. If they bore children, the state ignored them. If they were abused, they had no legal recourse. And if they aged out of desirability, their licenses were often revoked, leaving them destitute. Yet some navigated the system with astonishing savvy. In Paris, a few well-known madams rose to prominence, not only as operators of brothels, but as informal diplomats and social gatekeepers. Madame Gourdin, for instance, operated one of the most famous maisons in 18th century Paris, frequented by nobles, clergy, and even royal advisors. She kept detailed records, cultivated alliances with police, and was known to destroy compromising letters upon payment. One visitor wrote, "Her house was not of sin, but of politics dressed in rouge." Still, the system was deeply classed. While the upper classes flirted with licensed pleasure, the poor bore the brunt of enforcement. Streetwalkers without papers were arrested by les mouches, plainclothes police specializing in vice. Once caught, they were taken to the Salpêtrière, a prison hospital where deviant women were confined, re-educated, or forcibly relocated to colonies. And yet even here, records were kept. The Salpêtrière archives contained thousands of entries, brief, cold, and chillingly routine. Geneviève, aged 17, unlicensed, found loitering near Pont-Neuf. Infirm. Marie-Claire, expelled from Bordeaux, accused of soliciting a priest, detained indefinitely. Each line a life, each name a transaction, and still the money flowed. French kings, even as they waged wars and debated morality, never quite dismantled the system. Louis XV's court was famously indulgent. His Parc aux Cerfs, a private residence for young mistresses, operated in parallel to the licensed districts. The hypocrisy was not hidden, it was codified. Ordinary sex was taxed, royal sex was excused. But what did this mean for the women? Some viewed the license as a form of agency, better to be legal, documented, and semi-protected than at the mercy of alleyways. Others saw it as another form of servitude, dressed in bureaucracy. One anonymous poem from the 1780s, penned by a former courtesan, reads, "I pay the king for every kiss. He counts them more than I recall, but never once does he ask why. I sell what he taxed me to give." So what happens when love, or at least longing, is measured in coin clauses and crown stamps? Was the sex tax a clever solution to an ancient reality? Or the coldest example of statecraft folding the body into its ledgers? The chandeliers of Versailles glitter, perfumed letters pass hand to hand, courtiers whisper behind fans. But if you walk just beyond the gilded galleries down into the cluttered archives of state, you'll find another kind of record, bound in soft calfskin and numbered by quill. Ledger number 41, Ravenous Divers, Taxe sur les femmes publiques. Line after line carefully inked in clerical script, tallies not shipments or ships but bodies. The French monarchy was obsessed with order of lineage, of nobility, of blood, and quite clearly of lust. By the 18th century, the regulation of prostitution had become so refined, so exacting, that the kingdom of pleasure resembled a ministry all its own. Let's take a look inside that machine. Monthly inspections were the norm in most large cities. Every registered courtesan or brothel worker was expected to report to a médecin inspecteur, a state-assigned physician, who examined her for symptoms of venereal disease, particularly syphilis. If she passed, her license was renewed for another 30 days. If she failed, she was confined to a hospital ward until cleared. These medical examinations were deeply flawed, limited in science, performed without consent, and often degrading, but they became a central justification for continuing the sex tax. Government officials argued, better to tax and monitor sin than to ignore it, and allow infection to spread. This logic, coldly utilitarian, cemented the idea that the state could, and should, manage intimacy for the public good. Meanwhile, records grew thicker. In cities like Bordeaux, Lyon, and Toulouse, brothel inspectors carried small booklets listing each registered woman by name, alias, height, weight, eye color, dental state, and favored client type, military, merchant, noble, etc. These descriptions read more like livestock registries than human records. One reads, Lisette, known as Lily Rose, blonde, 5 pieds, 3 pouces, missing 1 molar, frequented by naval officers. Complaints of temperament, requires supervision. These books were updated quarterly. Corrections, pregnant, runaway, deceased, were scrawled in margins, sometimes with little ceremony. But not all women were anonymous. Some gained reputations so powerful they disrupted the entire system. Take Marie-Louise O'Murphy, a working-class girl of Irish descent, who caught the eye of Louis XV himself. She rose not through licensed brothels but through painterly admiration, captured nude by Boucher in a now iconic reclining portrait. The king invited her to the Parc aux Cerfs, his private residence for mistresses, bypassing all bureaucratic constraint. She was never taxed, never inspected, never registered. Her position, like those of many royal mistresses, existed outside the legal system she once belonged to. Here lies the deep contradiction of the sex tax. The very men who profited from it exempted themselves from it. Kings had lovers, dukes kept mistresses, bishops maintained secret households, and yet the state continued to fine and control poor women for the same acts performed at court, only without embroidery and discretion. The hypocrisy was public knowledge. Satirical pamphlets circulated in taverns and cafes, mocking Louis XV as le roi libertin and portraying the police as pimps in powdered wigs. One popular woodcut showed the king holding a coin purse above a naked woman, proclaiming, "For France." Yet behind the laughter the system endured, because it worked. The sex tax funded roads. The sex tax supported hospitals. The sex tax helped pay royal debts. It also allowed police and administrators to gather intelligence. Brothels became informal hubs of espionage. Conversations between clients, especially travelling merchants, visiting nobles, and military men, were overheard, noted, and sometimes reported. House madams were occasionally bribed to pass along names or secrets. One letter from the Lieutenant General of Police in Paris to a regional governor reads, "Maintain good relations with Madame Belot of Rue Montmartre. Her guests are indiscreet. She listens." In this way, the pleasure houses became political tools wrapped in perfume and lace, but not everyone complied. By the late 1700s, an underground network of independent sex workers had emerged, operating without licenses, without oversight, and without the burden of taxation. Many of these women preferred the risks of illegality to the humiliations of inspection and control. They formed alliances, passed along safe addresses, and even devised codes to avoid detection. One such code involved hanging a red handkerchief from a second-story window on market days, signaling availability. Another involved chalk marks on doorways, easily wiped away. In response, police increased patrols, raided unregistered brothels, and forced women into moral reform houses. These facilities were meant to rehabilitate fallen women through prayer, labor, and silence. In truth, they were often prisons, and yet the ledger kept growing. The sex tax by the eve of the French Revolution had become one of the most peculiar contradictions of the Ancien regime, a system that claimed moral guardianship while profiting from sin, a system that policed women for survival while ignoring men for indulgence. And as revolutionary whispers began to stir, so too did anger over this hypocrisy. Pamphlets like Le Cri de la Putaine, the cry of the whore, circulated, demanding not just the end of the tax but the recognition of sex workers as laborers, not criminals. They argued that if France could profit from their bodies, then France owed them something in return: protection, dignity, respect. One writer declared, "If the crown counts our kisses, let it count our hunger too." But when the Bastille fell and heads began to roll, the sex tax was not immediately abolished. Revolutionary leaders had other concerns, and in some cases, they simply rebranded the system, calling it public health regulation rather than taxation. It wasn't until much later, under the Napoleonic Code, that prostitution was reshaped yet again, legalized in certain conditions, confined in others, but always watched. So what do we make of this strange, calculated union between desire and governance? Was it pragmatism, cynicism, survival, or does it reveal something deeper about how power always finds ways to profit, even from the most private corners of human life? And if the state once taxed a kiss, can it ever truly separate itself from the warmth it once tried to price? The year is 1793. The guillotine has replaced the gallant curtsy. Versailles is stripped of its silk and gilt. Royal heads are rolling, and with them the many strange policies of the Ancien regime. Yet in a small backroom in Lyon, a clerk still dips his pen in ink and opens a registry of brothel receipts. The revolution has not yet reached every corner. The sex tax, though never officially enshrined in constitutional law, was an administrative reality for decades. It survived kings and councils, duchesses and madams, and even as the fabric of French society unraveled in the name of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the underlying machinery of surveillance and revenue collection continued, at least in the shadows. But with the fall of the monarchy came a re-evaluation of morality. Suddenly, what had been tolerated under royal indulgence was now seen through the sharp lens of republican virtue. The revolutionary government did not formally outlaw prostitution, but it frowned on it, especially in its more visibly taxed monarchical forms. Virtue was now patriotic. Bodies belonged to France, not the crown. Patriot wives were idealized as chaste, nurturing symbols of the republic. In this climate, the open commerce of sex, especially state-sanctioned brothels, became politically dangerous. The result? The bureaucracy of pleasure vanished, not through reform but through neglect. The registries stopped being updated. The licenses lapsed. Medical inspections continued in piecemeal ways, but without the full structure of the old sex tax apparatus. Brothel keepers, sensing the winds of change, often rebranded their establishments as boarding houses or music salons. And yet, many of the women stayed. They continued their work, now unlicensed and untaxed, but no less visible. In truth, the revolutionary era created new dangers. Without the flawed protections of the old system, many sex workers were subject to arbitrary arrest. Police could now accuse them of incivisme, anti-citizen behavior, or worse, corrupting the republic. In Paris, it is estimated that hundreds of former licensed sex workers were detained during the Terror, not for selling sex but for being connected to the old system. Wearing a ribbon the wrong colour could be enough to suggest royalist sympathies. Having once paid a license tax to the crown, dangerous. Some were imprisoned. A few were executed. Yet even in this perilous time, women resisted. They formed loose networks, protected each other's names, hid ledgers, and in some rare cases fled to the provinces where officials were less thorough. One extraordinary document, a fragment of a letter found in the archives of Marseille, reads, "We no longer write what we do. We braid hair. We teach dance. We polish mirrors. Let the new men call us what they wish, but we do not forget what they learned in our beds." It is unsigned. Eventually, as the revolution settled and gave way to the Napoleonic era, the state returned, as it always does, to the question of order. Napoleon Bonaparte, ever the tactician, did not seek to abolish prostitution. He sought to regulate it, this time under the flag of military necessity. Brothels were reclassified as houses of accommodation, and special zones were created near army barracks. The justification was pragmatic: better to control the spread of disease and the morale of troops than pretend sex didn't happen. But something fundamental had changed. Under the Ancien regime, The sex tax had been a strange kind of acknowledgement, an open ledger that said, "This is happening, and we profit from it." Under Napoleon and later regimes, the focus shifted to control without transparency. Sex was still sold, women were still monitored, but the ledgers became hidden. No longer celebrated in financial records, the old revenue lines disappeared, absorbed into police budgets or euphemized under public health. The overt link between pleasure and profit faded into the background, leaving only whispers in the archives. Today, if you walk the streets of Paris and look carefully, you can still see remnants. A curved brass plaque on a stone wall in the Marais once marked a licensed house. A faint outline of a red lantern above a door near Montmartre recalls its past. In the municipal archive, tucked behind layers of more respectable history, you might find ledger number 412, with its strange contents and silent names. Few talk about the sex tax anymore. It doesn't appear in history textbooks or patriotic documentaries. It's a footnote if mentioned at all. But for decades, centuries even, it was a quiet engine of statecraft, a compromise between morality and money. And for thousands of women, it was the system that defined their lives. Some used it to survive, a few used it to rise. Most simply navigated it, treading carefully between autonomy and exploitation, between performance and punishment. The state, of course, always got paid. But when the paper turned to dust, and the seals faded from the corners of licenses, what remained? Not just numbers, not just laws, but stories, letters, glances, records, scribbled in margins. A kiss, taxed, is still a kiss. A life registered is still a life. And perhaps the true legacy of the sex tax lies not in how France counted its pleasures, but in how we remember, or fail to remember, the people it counted. You awaken in the twilight hour of a Japanese court palace. The air is thick with incense, flowers wood, sandalwood, plum bark, each scent a code. Tatami mats hush your footsteps. Lanterns flicker beyond paper-thin shoji screens glowing like soft moons. Somewhere nearby, a courtier adjusts her robes, and behind the brocade curtains of a long, low sleeping chamber, an emperor is writing a poem to a woman he is not supposed to name. This is Heian-era Japan, the 9th through 12th centuries. A world where sex, love and longing are hidden beneath layers of etiquette, ink and whispers. It was a world ruled by ritual and restraint, but beneath that restraint lay deep sensuality. Never crude, rarely direct, always coded. Let's begin with the obvious question. Did emperors have sex? Yes, but not in the way you might think. Heian emperors were not warriors or politicians in the traditional sense. Much of their real power was ceremonial, and day-to-day affairs were often handled by powerful aristocratic clans like the Fujiwara, who placed daughters into the imperial household to influence succession. The emperor's role was almost spiritual, a living intermediary with the gods, but even spirits needed heirs. Sex, therefore, was part of statecraft. An emperor might have a primary consort called a chugu or empress, but also multiple secondary wives and favored concubines. Yorgo, Koyai, Naishi no Kami, among others, each ranked and each lodged in separate wings of the palace. These women were not nameless. Many were educated aristocrats, poets, musicians and calligraphers in their own right, and their nighttime interactions with the emperor, carefully choreographed, meticulously recorded, and most intriguingly, often initiated through poetry. If a noble woman wished to attract the emperor's attention, she might send a folded fan wrapped in brocade containing a poem written in elegant kana. If he was intrigued, he would reply in verse. This exchange might go on for days before a visit was suggested. When a nighttime encounter did occur, it was called miyabi, a concept that translates not directly to sex but to courtly elegance and romantic propriety. The emperor would not simply walk into a room. His visit would be announced by fragrance. Courtiers rubbed robes with plum, smoked their sleeves over incense burners, and arranged silks to rustle in just the right way. The goal was never to conquer, but to appreciate, and after the encounter, the following morning's custom was deeply telling. A poem was expected from the emperor, not a report, not an order, but a poetic reflection, left with the lady, or sent to her chamber later that day. These as a no-uta, morning-after poems, served as both evidence of intimacy and political diplomacy. One recorded in the Gozen Wakashu, a Heian poetry anthology, reads, "Last night's frost, melted not by sun, but by the whisper of your sleeve against mine. It is soft, mysterious, but unmistakable." Now let's pause here. It's easy to romanticize this courtly world, but it was also profoundly hierarchical. Women were often groomed from birth to become imperial consorts, their education tailored toward aesthetics and emotional subtlety rather than autonomy. A woman's rank within the palace determined everything, from how often the emperor visited her, to the silks she could wear, to the amount of light allowed in her rooms. And not all visits were welcome. While poetry served as a kind of courtly consent, power dynamics were always at play. The emperor was divine. A refusal, even if gently phrased, could carry consequences. So many women participated in these rituals, not out of romance, but out of duty, survival, or familial ambition. Yet paradoxically, it is within this structure that some women found extraordinary voice. Take Murasaki Shikibu, lady-in-waiting to Empress Shoshi, and author of the tale of Genji, often considered the world's first novel. Through her fictional prince Genji, Murasaki explored the emotional complexity of courtly romance, the fragility of status, and the sorrow of fleeting intimacy. Her insights weren't just fictional, they were observations from within. She writes, "The dew that gathers on the grass, will it remain until tomorrow? Love in the palace is much the same." Even more revealing are the pillow books, personal diaries kept by court ladies. Most famous among them is Sedi Shonagon's Makura no Soshi, a dazzling collection of anecdotes, lists, and sharp observations. In one passage she muses, "It is amusing when a man, having stayed the night, leaves at dawn thinking he has gone unnoticed, though everyone hears the clatter of his gekka." There is wit here, a sense of private power. The women of the court observed everything, even the men who thought themselves clever. The emperor's intimacy, then, was never truly private. Every visit, every scent, every poem left in the aftermath was watched, noted, and often passed on by attending maidservants, scribes, and other courtiers. Gossip was its own form of currency. And yet, amid this controlled intimacy, a strange tenderness emerges. Because in the Heian court, love was not declared with loud speeches or grand gestures. It was folded in paper, brushed in ink, echoed in metaphor. "Your sleeves are damp" might mean, "I missed you." "The moon tonight seems thinner" could imply disappointment. Even physical beauty was described in indirect terms. Rather than praising a woman's face, one might admire the grace of her sleeve or the line of her handwriting. Sexual encounters, when described, were usually obscured in mist and metaphor. But that did not make them less intimate, only less direct. In this way, the emperor's bedchamber was not only a place of pleasure, but a stage of language. And so we ask, if intimacy is conducted entirely through symbols, if the scent of plum or the shade of silk says what lips do not, can one ever be truly known? Or is love in such a world always a kind of performance? Let us step deeper into the stillness of the Heian court, into chambers where desire and diplomacy blurred under lamplight. We are no longer speaking of fluttering fans and moonlit poems alone. Now we speak of succession, of genealogy, of the quiet calculations made beneath brocade quilts. Because for all its romance, the emperor's bed was above all else a cradle for dynastic continuity. And yet in this age of poetic discretion, even a child's origin could become an enigma. To understand the full complexity, we must first examine the ranking system of women in the imperial palace. This was not a matter of jealousy or preference alone. It was a codified structure, with implications reaching far beyond the boudoir. An emperor typically had one empress, Kogo, the highest-ranking consort, often selected from the most powerful clan; Kori, lesser concubines, often serving the emperor's personal needs; Naishi no Kami, women of the inner court who might serve as secretaries or intimate attendants. Each woman lived in her own residence within the palace compound, and her access to the emperor was governed not only by her status, but by a complex schedule orchestrated by senior court ladies and administrators. The politics of these assignments could be fierce. A woman might wait weeks for a night with the emperor, and when it came, her chamber was carefully prepared, screens adjusted, incense selected, bedding fluffed. She would dress in 12-layered robes, her hair perfumed and brushed into floor-length waves, her teeth dyed black in keeping with court fashion. Then came the arrival, rarely dramatic, a soft rustle, a murmur through the screen, the slide of a door. The emperor often came alone or with a single attendant, no trumpets, no fanfare, just the sound of the past gliding into the present. But even here, subtle games were at play. If a woman were to conceive, her rank immediately shifted. She might be promoted. Her family might rise with her. Entire clan fortunes were made or broken by the question of whose child would be the emperor's acknowledged heir. Which brings us to a curious and very boring but deeply human problem. How could one know? Heian society placed immense value on emotional restraint and privacy, especially in matters of the body. Open claims of paternity were seen as vulgar, and DNA tests, of course, were centuries away. Thus, the birth of a child required the mother to declare, with full confidence and cultural expectation, who the father was, and the court was expected to accept it. This led to complication. If multiple women had relations with the emperor, or with high-ranking courtiers, which sometimes occurred, and a child was born 9 or 10 months later, the attribution of parentage could be murky. In rare but whispered cases, imperial offspring may not have been fathered by the emperor at all, but because the mother belonged to his inner court, and no one dared question her word, the child was considered legitimate. This ambiguity created a strange paradox. Courtly chastity was performed, but not always practiced. A woman might receive visits from other noblemen, often at night and in secrecy, especially if her official rank denied her access to the emperor. These liaisons were rarely documented, but the consequences, if they resulted in a child, could ripple through generations. To address this delicate issue, some women began keeping private journals, much like pillow books, but for personal record keeping. These were not meant for publication. They were more like insurance policies, quiet confirmations of timing, visits and moods, written in a soft hand and hidden beneath floorboards. Historians believe that Lady Murasaki herself may have kept such records, based on the structure of the tale of Genji, which so accurately maps emotional patterns, seasonal visits, and the intimate routines of the palace. And, of course, there were no official birth announcements in the modern sense. Instead, when a child was born, messengers delivered news by way of coloured fans, specific incense compositions, or in more public cases, a formal poem of gratitude posted on the palace gates. The words were always poetic, but their meanings were unmistakable. One such poem, recorded in the year 1012, reads, "The plum tree bows to the early snow. A new bud forms, though winter still holds breath." That bud, we understand, was a son. As children grew, their status followed their mother's rank. A child of the empress might be named crown prince. A child of a lesser nyogo might still be honoured but would not typically ascend to the throne unless politics dictated otherwise. This, of course, created competition. Fathers, mothers and clans manoeuvred with all the subtlety of a tea ceremony. Gifts were exchanged, alliances were formed, and through it all the emperor remained distant. Symbolic. He visited where invited, wrote when moved, and ruled most often through absence. But absence could also be a kind of power. In a system so built upon suggestion and silence, the withholding of attention was as meaningful as its bestowal. A lady who failed to receive a reply to her poem might understand that her favour had waned. One whose quarters were moved farther from the emperor's own would recognise a fall in standing. Still, some women managed to hold power for decades, not through charm alone, but through clever networking, a command of poetry, and an ability to navigate the moods of a palace held together by plum blossoms and political games. We must also speak of same-sex intimacy, which was not uncommon in Heian court culture. Among both men and women, emotional and romantic relationships developed, especially in cloistered environments where gender roles were tightly codified but physically fluid. These relationships, while rarely recorded in detail, sometimes appear in poetry or diaries. They were not necessarily scandalous unless they threatened succession. And what of the emperor, in his later years? When his role as lover and father gave way to ritual and reflection, he often retired to become a cloistered emperor, taking on a semi-monastic lifestyle while continuing to influence the court behind the scenes. Some of these retired emperors left behind collections of poems, meditations, and letters. Few mention their romantic lives, but allude to a kind of soft melancholy. One fragment reads, "So many sleeves I brushed in youth, yet none remain to smooth the creases of my robe tonight." The intimacy of a life lived through suggestion, a history traced not through proclamations or scandals, but through folded paper, fragrant sleeves, and whispers after the lanterns were dimmed. So in a world where the emperor's duty was to reproduce but never to flaunt, to love but never to declare, what did sex actually mean? Was it a political ritual, a spiritual offering, a quiet rebellion, or just one more poem written in the night, folded and forgotten in the morning light? The centuries passed, the robes grew heavier, the halls grew quieter, and the once vivid poetry that floated through the Heian palace began to fade into the pages of old scrolls, tucked in lacquered boxes, stored in cedar-lined libraries. The lovers disappeared, the emperors aged, the silken layers yellowed, but traces remained, not in the marble of monuments but in the soft grain of paper, the corners of diaries, the fragrance of rituals remembered. This is the final breath of a world where sex was a ceremony, not spoken but coded, and where memory itself became the final lover of the imperial court. Let us begin where all things do in the Heian court, with writing. If the act of sex was rarely described in literal terms, its emotional wake was often recorded. In the tale of Genji, for example, we find entire chapters dedicated not to the act itself, but to the shame, yearning, or loneliness that followed. These feelings were not flaws in the system, they were the very proof that intimacy had taken place. But over time, the form of expression began to shift. As the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333, arrived, Japan transitioned from courtly rule to military governance. The samurai class rose, emperors lost influence. The elegant rituals of Heian love were replaced by stoicism, discipline, and in many cases silence. Still, the imperial family continued, sometimes in seclusion, sometimes in puppet-like visibility, depending on the politics of the era. But their romantic lives, once encoded in verse and silk, now became matters of national image. By the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate had fully assumed control, and the emperor became a symbolic figure, largely confined to the imperial palace in Kyoto. His personal affairs, especially those of the flesh, were no longer just poetic, they were carefully censored. Why? Because the shogunate, while outwardly moralistic, feared any scandal or impropriety that might upset the fragile hierarchy between their military rule and the divine status of the emperor. And so the rituals of intimacy became even more private, even more regulated, and ironically less emotionally vivid than during the romantic Heian era. The pillow books fell silent. Letters, once filled with sighs and longing metaphors, grew sparse or were destroyed outright. The emperor still married, still fathered children, but these events were recorded as functions of state, not as expressions of soul. It was around this time that many imperial love poems were quietly removed from public archives. Some were lost to fire, flood, or war. Others were simply deemed inappropriate for the new moral tone of the age. We know of this erasure not because of what survives, but because of the gaps in anthologies, the missing entries, and the frustrated notes of later historians who found whole court years mysteriously undocumented. And yet, not all memory was lost. In rural temples and aristocratic households, copies of old court poetry survived. Some were kept not for their political significance, but for their beauty. A reminder of a time when love was allowed to be quiet, complex, even sad. And then came the Meiji Restoration. In 1868, the emperor was restored as head of state, and Japan underwent a sweeping modernization effort. Western influence surged. The emperor was now expected to appear in public, wear military uniforms, and present his family as morally upright symbols of the nation. This moral theatre required a new kind of forgetting. Gone were the poems slipped under screens. Gone were the multiple wives and concubines. The Heian model of imperial love, with its ambiguity, layered affections, and poetic afterglow, was rebranded as inappropriate for a modern empire. In its place came a sanitized history. Textbooks described emperors as noble and chaste. Romantic liaisons were deleted. Pillow books were sidelined as curiosities of the past, amusing but unimportant. But in doing so, Japan erased something more than just titillation. It erased a profound record of emotional intelligence, aesthetic vulnerability, and a deeply unique way of expressing desire. Because the truth is, what the Heian court practiced was not simply sex, but a literary intimacy, an emotional negotiation, a dance of ink, scent, and suggestion. Few cultures in human history have treated the act of romantic connection with such stylistic reverence, and today scholars look back not to confirm genealogies or measure the power of these emperors, but to listen for the emotional tone beneath the words they left behind. What does it mean when a man in power writes, "Though your sleeves did not linger, I am still cold"? What does it mean when a woman responds, "It is not the season that changed, it is the guest who did not return"? These fragments, scattered across scrolls and anthologies, are all that remain of bedside lives once central to the palace. They do not offer certainty, they do not name names, but they offer something else. Texture. The quiet knowledge that human connection, however structured, however muted, leaves traces, not just in children or records, but in language, in ritual, in the faded edges of folded poems no longer opened. So what is the legacy of the emperor's beds? Not scandal, not shock, but a kind of ghost scent of elegance. An intimacy that valued reflection over declaration, and one that understood, that which is hidden is not forgotten. That which is whispered can still echo, and that which is written in the dark on the soft grain of washi paper can outlast a throne. The morning sun has just risen above the marble domes of Agra Fort, glinting off the latticework screens of the Zenana, the secluded quarters of the royal Mughal harem. You cannot see what lies behind those intricately carved jali windows, but the women within can see you. Welcome to the inner world of the Mughal queens, where love and politics were woven into silk and whispered through scented halls. Here, sex was not simply indulgence, it was regulation, ritual, and reputation, and it was not always the emperor who held the most power in the chamber of pleasure. Let us begin with the architecture, because the structure of the palace itself shaped the nature of intimacy. The Mughal harem, called the zenana, was not just a cluster of private bedrooms. It was a city within a city, populated by queens, princesses, concubines, female attendants, musicians, midwives, cooks and guards. Entry was strictly limited to women, with the rare exception of the emperor and a few trusted eunuchs. Each woman had her own quarters, sometimes entire apartments depending on her rank. The walls were decorated not with paintings of lovers but with verses from the Quran, calligraphy, and geometric motifs, aesthetic control reinforcing the public image of piety and discipline. But behind those verses and veils there was life, vibrant, complex, and often contradictory. The first thing to understand is that Mughal queens were not merely passive figures tucked away in luxurious obscurity. Many wielded substantial influence over the emperor, the court, and even imperial policy. Some were patrons of art, architecture, and literature. Others engaged in charitable work, legal advocacy, and occasionally diplomacy. Consider Empress Noor Jahan, wife of Emperor Jahangir. She was not born royal, but rose to become the de facto co-ruler of the empire. Coins were minted in her name. She issued imperial orders, farman, and held court behind a purdah screen. She was also, undeniably, a woman of passion. But hers was not the passion of a seductress, it was the passion of control. It's said that Noor Jahan selected the emperor's clothing, his daily diet, and even regulated his visits to other consorts. She created a structured calendar for when Jahangir could visit, which quarters, a ritualized rotation that kept the harem from devolving into jealous chaos. But not all women of the zenana had such control. There were hundreds of women, especially in the time of Akbar and Shah Jahan. While queens like Nur Jahan, Mumtaz Mahal, and Jahanara Begum were revered, lesser-ranked women often faded into anonymity. They had little say in the matter of sex. Their function was reproductive and ceremonial. They were gifts from noble houses, political offerings, or daughters of defeated rivals, folded into the imperial household as a symbol of submission. And yet, even among these women, bonds formed. The zenana was full of poetry recitations, embroidery circles, whispered gossip, and music. Women wrote letters, kept diaries, and composed verses that blended the erotic with the devotional. While official chronicles ignored their voices, folk songs and oral histories kept their stories alive. We must also speak of the ritual of the emperor's visit. It was never spontaneous. A visit to a queen's chamber was preceded by 3 stages of preparation: scenting the rooms, rose water sprinkled on cushions, atars massaged into the skin, perfumed smoke wafted through corridors. Dress and presentation. The queen might don a silk robe embroidered with verses of longing. Jewels weren't worn to impress the emperor, but to invoke auspicious energy, a particular emerald to cool his temperament, or pearls to soothe tension. Offerings. A tray of seasonal fruits, betel leaves, or saffron milk would be set out, symbols of fertility, sensuality, and hospitality. And then, quietly, the emperor would arrive, escorted only by eunuchs who stopped at the outer threshold. Inside, the encounter was not simply about physical intimacy, it was a negotiation of affection and influence. A favoured queen might use the moment to speak of court appointments, marriage alliances, or family concerns. A lesser consort might offer a carefully composed ghazal, hoping to be remembered. Even a single night of pleasure could result in an elevation of status, a new chamber, or a child with imperial recognition. And what of love? Yes, love existed. It was rare, perhaps, but powerful when it appeared. The most famous example is Shah Jahan's devotion to Mumtaz Mahal. Though he had other wives as required by political custom, he was deeply attached to Mumtaz. Their relationship is recorded as one of emotional closeness, shared counsel, and consistent companionship. She accompanied him on military campaigns. He trusted her judgment, and after her death during childbirth, he commissioned the Taj Mahal, the most famous monument to love in the world. But even here we must pause, for the Taj Mahal, in all its grandeur, also erased the other women of the harem, women who bore children, shared beds, and raised princes, but were never immortalized in marble. Their stories remain in scraps, lines in letters, fragments in memoirs, rumors in travelers' accounts. Some of these fragments are oddly touching. One note from a courtier describes a lesser consort, unnamed, who taught a prince how to read by etching letters into rice flour on the floor. She was never formally acknowledged, but the prince visited her every-eyed until her death. Another whispers of a queen who refused the emperor's visit after a quarrel, locking her chamber doors and sending out a poem that simply read, "Even the moon must wait behind clouds." These quiet acts of rebellion, of teaching, of remembrance, speak to the emotional ecosystem of the Mughal harem. It was not simply a prison, nor a paradise. It was a place where desire wore many faces: ambition, loyalty, loneliness, power, where queens embroidered love letters into handkerchiefs, or mixed sedatives into milk to avoid imperial attention, where a woman could rise to command an empire or be forgotten by dawn. And yet all of it happened behind a screen, behind jarocas where women watched processions they could never join, behind curtains where they gave birth, made love, wept, plotted. So what did it mean to live in such a place, to be both visible and unseen, to be desired, but never allowed to walk freely among those who desired you? The answer, perhaps, lies in the folds of silk and parchment, in the walls that remember whispers, and in the women who learned to shape empires, not with swords but with lullabies and locked doors. The flicker of a single oil lamp casts long shadows across the whitewashed walls of the zenana. Somewhere beyond the marble lattice the city of Agra sleeps. But within these inner quarters, a queen groans softly, breath laboured, wrists scented with rose and sandalwood. She is in labour. A midwife wipes her brow. An older attendant whispers verses from the Quran. Incense is lit, not just for fragrance but for blessing. Because this is not just a birth, it is a political event. To give birth in the Mughal harem was to risk everything: your body, your rank, your future. And no one knew this more intimately than the women who lived behind the veils. While the emperors ruled from ornate thrones and public balconies, the future of the dynasty was often determined in quiet birthing rooms, attended only by women and eunuchs. There were no royal physicians from the outside world here. Male doctors were not permitted into the harem. All care was provided by female specialists, some of whom served generations of queens, and passed on knowledge orally, mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice. These women, the dyers, were experts in herbal medicine, massage, birth positions, and pain management. They knew which oils to apply when the labour stalled, which prayers to whisper when the cord was tangled, which teas to brew from cloves, fennel, or dried lotus seed when a mother hemorrhaged. They worked in silence, but they wielded tremendous influence. A successful birth elevated not just the mother, but the entire family. Suddenly, a woman once considered a minor consort became the mother of a potential emperor. Her voice mattered more, her chamber grew larger. Servants bowed deeper. Her relatives might receive new titles or land grants, but success was far from guaranteed. Mughal childbirth was dangerous, and often deadly. Even the most luxurious surroundings could not prevent complications: hemorrhage, infection, or exhaustion. Empress Mumtaz Mahal, wife of Shah Jahan, died delivering her 14th child at just 38 years old. Her death devastated the emperor, but it also triggered a power vacuum in the harem. With the queen gone, factions began to form. Other wives and consorts, long silent, stepped forward. Who would raise the surviving children? Who would be closest to the emperor's ear? Who would guide the next crown prince? The answer often lay not in affection, but in timing and alliance. A powerful queen might ensure that her own brother or uncle received high court appointments. In turn, those men would promote her interests, build her palace, protect her son. If her son died, her influence withered, but if he lived and thrived, she might govern behind the curtain for decades. The most striking example is Jahanara Begum, daughter of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. Though she never married, she became one of the most influential women in the empire after her mother's death. She held immense property, commissioned architecture, wrote mystical poetry, and acted as a counselor to her father. During his later years, she remained at his side while her brothers fought for the throne. Her unmarried status gave her mobility and independence rare for a royal woman, and yet she never left the zenana, because even power in the harem came with chains. Let's pause here to consider a detail often overlooked: child loss. While chronicles proudly record the sons who survived to rule, few mention the countless miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths that haunted the zenana. The women, however, remembered. Some inscribed poems on the tombs of lost children, others kept locks of hair in embroidered sachets. A few quietly funded waqfs, charitable endowments, in memory of children who never lived long enough to be named. These acts were not political, they were personal. And yet even grief could be used. A grieving mother might receive greater compassion from the emperor. She might leverage her suffering to gain time, gifts, or space. In this sense, even sorrow became part of the delicate chess game of survival. Pregnancy in the harem was thus more than biological. It was ritual, performance, and strategy. A royal birth involved months of seclusion toward the end of pregnancy, with specific dietary restrictions and religious observance. Gifts sent by courtiers and rivals alike, silks, jewelry, bowls of gold coins, often with subtle political messages embedded in the embroidery or calligraphy. Naming ceremonies, where the newborn's title was announced with drums and incense, and sweets were distributed to the wider court. But not every child was claimed. Some were raised in distant palaces, away from the politics of the central Zena. Some were quietly sent to religious tutors, only to re-emerge years later as courtiers or commanders. Daughters were often married off to allied nobles or regional governors, sometimes against their will. Others, born of low-ranking mothers, were never acknowledged. Even among those who were recognized, survival was a struggle. A prince born too early or too sickly was often seen as a liability, not a blessing. Some were protected obsessively, their every breath monitored. Others were discarded by the tides of dynastic preference. Still the mothers hoped. A line from a poem attributed to a Mughal queen, though unnamed, reads, "I wrapped him in silk, but he preferred the dust. His breath was brief, but the silence remains." The emotion is muted, dignified, but unmistakable. And so we ask, in a world where birth determined destiny, where a night of imperial pleasure could shape an empire, what did it mean to give life inside the Zena? Was it empowerment? Sacrifice? A duty disguised as privilege? Or was it simply the price women paid to remain visible, if only for a moment? The emperor has died. Perhaps the drums of mourning echo across the courtyards of the Red Fort. Perhaps the calligraphers are already copying the funeral decree in ink made from crushed camphor and tears. Perhaps the imperial astrologers quietly gather their charts, nodding that the omens had been right all along. But inside the Zenana, the world ends in silence. For the queens, concubines, and attendants who once scented the emperor's robes and bore his children, the death of the sovereign marks not only the loss of a man but the erasure of their place in history. Because in the Mughal world, what followed love was not freedom but disappearance. Let us begin with the concept of imperial widowhood. There was no single law dictating the treatment of royal widows. Instead, customs varied by emperor, region, and the widow's own standing. Some were allowed to remain in the harem, others were retired to separate quarters, often smaller, quieter, and farther from the centre of political life. A favoured queen, such as Mumtaz Mahal, though she died before Shah Jahan, might be remembered through monuments, public poetry, and annual rites. But others simply vanished. One day they appeared at court festivals in peacock-feathered robes. The next, they were folded away like last season's silk. Some of this was religious. Islamic tradition encouraged modesty and seclusion after a husband's death, typically a period of 4 months and 10 days. But for Mughal widows, this period often lasted a lifetime. They might be prohibited from remarrying, regardless of age, their movements restricted, their voices hushed. Why? Because once the emperor was gone, so was their political utility. Widows could no longer bear imperial heirs. Their alliances became liabilities. Their continued presence might stir old rivalries, or threaten the new ruler's legitimacy, especially if the widow was the mother of a prince who lost the throne. Some were even exiled, politely but firmly, to distant forts or garden retreats, out of sight, out of relevance, but not out of memory. Let us now speak of a different kind of resistance, memory-making. Some Mughal widows wrote memoirs. Others endowed mosques, wells, or schools in their names. A few became mystic patrons, withdrawing from the court to embrace Sufi orders, engaging in charity, prayer, and quiet influence. One such woman was Gulbadan Begum, daughter of Emperor Babur and aunt of Akbar. Though not a widow herself, she documented court life in one of the earliest recorded memoirs by a Mughal woman, the Humayun Nama. Her writing is spare, factual, even dull, but in that dullness lies its power. She records what the men forgot, the illnesses, the marriages, the quiet rifts, the forgotten travels of women and children who lived in the shadows of history. She gives them back to us. Other women turn to architecture. Though we associate Mughal monuments with male builders, many were commissioned by women using their personal wealth. Ruqayya Sultan Begum, Akbar's first wife, funded religious schools and libraries. Jahanara Begum, as mentioned earlier, built caravanserais and Sufi shrines. Even lesser-known women sometimes sponsored small water fountains, public rest houses, or garden tombs, symbols not of power, but of presence. Still, many left nothing behind but names in genealogies, and some not even that. We know of unnamed concubines buried in unmarked graves, daughters married off to provincial rulers whose histories were never written, young women who died in childbirth before they could be painted or remembered, and yet, in rare cases, the ghosts remain. European travellers visiting the Mughal court, like François Bernier or Nicolau Mannucci, sometimes recorded rumors of widowed queens who still ruled the zenana, instructing younger women, advising their sons or grandsons, veiled behind gauze curtains but unmistakably in control. These whispers are unverifiable, but tantalizing. They suggest that even after death removed the emperor, some women refused to vanish. Instead, they adapted, changed roles, became custodians of memory. Perhaps they kept letters never sent, drafts of poems folded in linen, faded portraits embroidered into pillow covers. Perhaps they told bedtime stories that doubled as political allegories, preparing the next generation for a court they themselves could no longer walk freely. Perhaps they simply endured, because endurance was its own kind of rebellion. In the Mughal harem, where sex was codified, birth was ceremonial, and status was fragile, the ultimate act of defiance may have been simply this: to live long enough to be forgotten, but never to forget. One final story lingers in the records. We cannot verify its authenticity. It comes from a 17th century Persian manuscript, now held in fragments in a library in Lucknow. It tells of a widowed queen never named who lived to be nearly 90. She requested before her death to be buried with three things: a lock of hair from her firstborn son, a jade pen given to her by the emperor on their wedding night, and a slip of paper. On that paper was a poem written in her own hand. "You married me in spring, when the mango trees flowered. I have outlived every blossom, but I still smell the season." It is not a record, it is not a law, but it is a reminder that even in a palace where sex was political, where love was ritualized, and where memory was censored, some stories bloomed quietly in the cracks, and they have not all faded. The Nile shimmers under the late afternoon sun, as reeds sway and ibis birds wade in the shallows. Beyond the riverbank, hidden behind painted walls and thick limestone corridors, is the domain of the great royal wife, not just a partner of the pharaoh, but a keeper of divine order. To walk into her chambers is to step into another world, one scented with blue lotus and almond oil, where gold glints in the filtered light and papyrus scrolls whisper secrets forgotten by time. This is not a tale of Cleopatra, that famous last queen whose name overshadows millennia. This is a tale of the queens before her, those who lived in the shadows of gods, those whose desires were written in hieroglyphs, not on scandalous scrolls. Welcome to the intimate world of ancient Egypt's royal women. Let's begin with her title. In ancient Egypt, the title Hemet Nesh Viret, Great Wife of the King, was more than ceremonial. It marked a woman as the chief consort, the symbolic mother of the land, and occasionally a co-ruler. She held court. She had her own temple offerings. She sometimes even wore the vulture headdress, a divine symbol of protection and maternal power. But behind the divine imagery were living women with their own pleasures, expectations and limitations. Where did they live? The great wife resided in the harem palace, though the term harem is misleading. It wasn't a place of idle pleasure or isolated indulgence. Rather, it was a self-contained complex, quarters, gardens, administrative offices and workshops where women were educated, served and ruled over a community of other women and children. They were secluded, yes, but not passive. These women managed economies, oversaw scribes, priests, musicians and nurses. They commissioned statues, funded temples, and even supervised construction. Their influence was often bureaucratic, spiritual, and quietly personal. Because behind the gold and incense was a daily life of structured intimacy. You might imagine the pharaoh visiting his great wife in the evening, after state rituals and offerings. The door would be sealed behind him. Literally, ancient Egyptian doorways had seals of clay and rope, stamped with the pharaoh's signet to ensure privacy and to signify sacred union. The bedchamber was likely sparse by modern standards. There was no luxurious mattress, but rather a low, curved wooden frame with a footrest, linen sheets, reed mats, maybe a carved stool for clothing and jewelry. The walls might depict not lovemaking, but scenes of protection, the goddess Hathor watching over the couple, or a painted sycamore tree symbolizing fertility and shade. And what of the act itself? Ancient Egyptian art is famously reticent when it comes to depicting sex. Unlike in some later cultures such as Greece or Rome, explicit scenes were not part of mainstream temple carvings or funerary art. But we do know that sexual union was linked with cosmic balance. The pharaoh himself was often viewed as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and in some myths, sexual union between Horus and Isis, or between sky and earth, represented the cyclical power of fertility. Thus, when the king lay with his queen, it was more than affection, it was divine reenactment. This sanctity made the queen's role both privileged and restricted. While she might desire affection, she could not demand it. While she might have influence, she did not always have freedom. And yet some queens found ways to express themselves. Consider Taye, the wife of Amenhotep III. She was not of royal birth, but rose to become one of the most powerful women in the New Kingdom. Her name appeared beside the kings on temple walls, a rare honor. Foreign rulers addressed her directly in diplomatic letters, asking for guidance, favors, and news. Some even sent her jewelry and perfumes as gifts. We do not know if her intimacy with Amenhotep was passionate, dutiful, or strategic, but we do know this. When he died, she retained her own court, her own seal, and continued to advise their son Akhenaten. Other queens left subtler marks. In tombs across the Valley of the Queens, we find cosmetic kits, scented oil jars, and even love poems carved into stone. One such poem, possibly from the Ramesside period, reads, "My heart flutters quickly when I think of you. You are near, but I dare not call. The scent of your oil is in the breeze. I wait like the flower waits for water." These poems were not religious texts. They were personal expressions, perhaps read aloud in gardens or whispered through curtain veils before sleep. And what of jealousy? The great wife was rarely the only wife. Pharaohs often had multiple consorts, especially for political alliances. The harem palace could include dozens of women, from Egyptian nobles to foreign princesses. These women, while treated with respect, rarely held the same authority as the great wife. Still, they bore children. Still, they competed for attention. There are scattered records of tension. One letter, written by a Hittite princess sent to marry the Egyptian king, laments her loneliness and lack of favor. Another inscription hints at a consort accused of witchcraft, possibly by rival women. But mostly, these stories are lost, recorded only through administrative shifts. One wife gaining lands, another disappearing from record. The politics of the heart were written in silence, in who was named, who was omitted, and who was buried close to the king. Because in death, as in life, the proximity of a queen's tomb to her husband said everything. Some were buried together in grand symmetry, others were tucked away in secondary chambers, their names weathered by time, and still others remain missing. So what did it feel like then to love the most powerful man in Egypt, but never truly belong to him? To rule from behind lattice and veil? To raise sons who might one day wear the crown, but also might die in palace intrigues? Was it devotion or survival? Was it joy or just another offering? As we leave the golden silence of her chamber, the only sound is that of papyrus fluttering in the river breeze. Her letters, her wishes, her longings, they drift now, barely remembered. But in the still air of history, they linger. The breeze that once carried the scent of blue lotus into the chambers of the great wife now carries something heavier, expectation. Because now the queen is not simply the wife of the god king, she is the mother of princes, and every glance, every whispered word in the court, every offering to the gods is weighed against that fact. She has birthed the bloodline, and with that comes not only honor, but extraordinary peril. In ancient Egypt, lineage was everything. To be born of royal blood wasn't just to inherit a crown, it was to embody Mata, the cosmic balance of the universe. And queens were tasked with more than simply producing heirs. They were expected to produce divine vessels, sons and daughters worthy of ruling an empire that had existed for over 1,000 years before they were even born. But what happens when the line falters? When the queen bears no children, or when her children die? Or worse, when they grow up to be threats to each other? Let us begin with a simple but often unspoken reality. Many royal women did not become mothers. Infertility, miscarriage, and infant death were common in the ancient world, Egypt no exception. Though pharaohs could father children with multiple wives, the status of a child always depended on the mother's rank. A son of the great wife was the ideal heir, but if she bore no sons or none who lived, her influence could rapidly decline. There is no clearer case than that of Queen Nefertari, the beloved wife of Ramesses II. Though she bore children and was honored lavishly in her lifetime, her tomb remains one of the most spectacular in Egypt. Her sons did not outlive their father. Ramesses reigned for nearly 70 years, outlasting multiple heirs. The throne eventually passed to a son of a lesser wife, one of dozens, and Nefertari, revered in death, but politically outpaced by time. Other queens watched their sons rise and fall amid dynastic intrigue. The royal court was not a peaceful garden. It was a landscape of ambition, spiritual omens, and quiet violence. Brothers competed, uncles plotted, mothers tried, desperately to protect what they had brought into the world. Consider Queen Taye, the matriarch of the powerful 18th dynasty. She bore Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten, the pharaoh who upended traditional religion, closed temples to Amun, and created a new capital at Amarna. His spiritual revolution shook Egypt's foundations, but Tyre stood by him, even as priests and nobles recoiled. When her husband Amenhotep III died, Tyre moved with her son to his new capital. Letters from foreign kings continued to address her with respect. She mediated disputes, maintained foreign alliances, and perhaps even softened the radical edges of her son's theology. But Tyre also watched the slow unraveling of the world she knew. Akhenaten's religious experiment collapsed after his death. His city was abandoned, his monuments were defaced, and the dynasty entered a period of shadow and silence, eventually leading to the short reign of Tutankhamun, her grandson. Queens like Tyre became symbols of continuity in a court of constant change, but their power was fragile. For every respected mother, there was another whose influence ended in tragedy. Some saw their sons executed in coups. Some were themselves exiled, accused of witchcraft or disloyalty. Some remained in the palace, silenced but still watching, and some became rulers themselves. Perhaps the most remarkable example is Hatshepsut, not just a great wife, but eventually pharaoh in her own right. After the death of her husband Thutmose II, and with his heir still a child, Hatshepsut first served as regent, then took the throne herself. She adopted male royal titles, was depicted in masculine form, and ruled for over 2 decades. Her reign was one of prosperity, temple building, and foreign trade, but she was still, always, a woman in a man's role. She remained unmarried. She relied heavily on a trusted official, Senenmut, whose relationship with her remains a subject of speculation. Were they lovers, allies, simply loyal partners in governance? What matters is not the romance but the choice. Hatshepsut chose power over domesticity. She chose rule over retreat. But her memory was later erased, her name chiseled from monuments, her statues destroyed. Only fragments remain. It is this fragility of legacy that haunts the royal mothers of Egypt. They may raise a pharaoh, they may shape an era, but the ink of power fades fast if not guarded carefully. Still, queens fought for their children. Some used priestly networks, offering temple donations in exchange for spiritual favor. Others hosted banquets, sponsored artists, or aligned with nobles who could support their sons' claims. A few, in rare cases, commanded military alliances to back their heirs, and always there were whispers, that another substituted a stillborn prince with a wet nurse's son, that royal dreams foretold doom for one bloodline and favor for another. Truth, maybe, but in the palace of the gods, rumor could be as deadly as fact. So what did it mean to love your child in such a place? To raise him in golden sandals but sleep with a dagger under your pillow? To see your daughters married at 14 to old governors? To offer daily prayers that your son might live, not just in body but in memory? It meant holding both pride and grief in equal measure. Because in Egypt, nothing was more sacred than legacy, and no one worked harder to secure it than the queens who gave birth not only to sons, but to stories, inscriptions, myths, and lineages. Some succeeded, others were lost, but all of them hoped. The sun dips low behind the cliffs of Deir el-Medina, casting long shadows across the limestone tombs. The breeze quiets. The Nile, ever faithful, carries its waters past the temples and palaces once filled with incense and music. But here in the Valley of the Queens, another story begins. One written not on papyrus but in stone. Here lie the wives of the pharaohs, some beloved, some powerful, some utterly forgotten. To speak of how Egyptian queens were remembered is to untangle a contradiction. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with immortality, and yet so many of these women vanished from history with barely a trace. Let us begin underground. Tombs of royal women were often located in the Valley of the Queens, west of Thebes, carved into the cliffs in secluded chambers. While the kings of the New Kingdom were entombed in the Valley of the Kings with grandeur and symbolism, their queens rested nearby, sometimes magnificently, sometimes modestly. The most famous of these, of course, is the tomb of Queen Nefertari, wife of Ramesses II. Discovered in 1904, her tomb stunned archaeologists. The walls are painted in vivid color, Nefertari in flowing linen, adorned in jewelry, playing board games with gods, passing into the afterlife with serene grace. Hieroglyphs surround her like blessings. Celestial blue ceilings arch above her. But what's more striking than the beauty is the intentionality. This wasn't just a burial, it was a performance of eternity. The Egyptians believed that memory was survival, that to speak a name was to keep a soul alive, that to show a woman reading, walking, offering or embracing the gods meant she would continue doing so forever. And so Nefertari lives still in brushstroke and pigment, in every caption that identifies her by name. But not every queen was given such luxury. For many, death was practical, not poetic. They were buried hastily, their tombs reused, their names scratched out when dynasties changed. Some queens were deliberately erased, victims of political coups or religious reform. A new pharaoh might eliminate any reference to a predecessor's favoured wife if her child posed a challenge to his own rule. Even the great Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh, was posthumously attacked. Her images were defaced, her cartouches chiselled away, statues broken. In some places, her name was replaced by that of her father or stepson, as if she had never ruled. For decades, scholars believed she had been merely a regent. Only in the 20th century was her true reign rediscovered. Imagine that, being queen of all Egypt, only to be buried in silence, your monuments left to dust. But erasure was not always political. Sometimes it was simply decay. Floods, tomb robbers, centuries of wind and sand wore away the fragile remnants of women's lives. If the tomb was looted, if the nameplate fell, if the papyrus crumbled, memory ended. And yet, even in fragments, the women whisper, a mirror etched with the name of a princess, a child's bracelet, likely worn by the daughter of a queen, a fragment of linen labelled with royal titles and scents of cinnamon. These small, ordinary objects, things never meant for fame, now serve as the only testimony to lives once filled with ceremony, music, and hope. What did queens hope for in death? To be reunited with their husbands? To rest beside the gods? To be remembered by their descendants? Many included Shapti figurines, tiny carved servants to work for them in the afterlife. Others had spells written to ward off snakes and fire. Some included hymns not of power but of love. One reads, "My heart is in the west, where he sleeps beneath the sand. I wait in my chamber of stone until he calls again." Not all were buried with kings. Some were interred with daughters, others in shared tombs with priestesses. A few were never found at all, perhaps buried in unmarked graves, perhaps intentionally hidden. And yet, in unexpected ways, many have been remembered. Modern Egyptology has recovered names once thought lost. Kia, the enigmatic wife of Akhenaten; Meritaten, a daughter who may have ruled briefly; Ahotep, a warrior queen who led armies against the Hyksos. Their names now appear in books, museums, lectures. They are spoken aloud again, thousands of years later. The immortality they once prayed for, not through gods, but through history. But there is something bittersweet in this form of remembrance, because we must also ask, what of the unnamed queens? What of the countless women who bore children, healed the sick, ruled the household, mediated court disputes, and were never recorded? What about the thousands of harem women who lived their entire lives inside palace walls, who laughed, sang, suffered, loved, and then vanished? What about the women whose names never made it to papyrus, much less stone? Their absence is not just a silence, it is a wound in the archive. And so, perhaps we honour them best not by grand discovery, but by quiet imagining, by pausing, as you do now, and thinking of a woman who once sat at her mirror, dipping a reed in black coal, adjusting her wig in the morning sun. She may have smiled, or sighed, or waited for a letter that never came. She may have dreamed of eternity, not as a goddess, but as someone remembered, even if only in a story told at night. The spoon trembles slightly as it reaches your lips. It's silver, polished, expensive, and possibly laced with stramonium. You can't be sure. You swallow anyway, because you are not the emperor, you are his taster. Welcome to the Roman court, where politics is poison and dinner is a battlefield. Long before food safety regulations, long before the invention of refrigeration or glass Tupperware, there was a single simple solution for rulers terrified of being murdered at supper: feed someone else first. And in the age of emperors, especially those ruling after the Republic collapsed, poison was not a paranoid fantasy, it was a daily possibility. Let us first understand the role. The pregustator, literally one who tastes beforehand, was a real and often respected role in the Roman court. Their job was as precise as it was terrifying. Taste every dish before the emperor, sip each cup of wine, test sauces, meats, fruits and oils, and then wait, sometimes for moments, sometimes for hours. No signs of dizziness, no sudden vomiting, no choking? Good. The emperor would dine, but if your knees buckled, if your mouth frothed, if your eyes widened in sudden terror, then congratulations, you had saved Rome, and perished doing it. Some tasters were slaves, others freedmen, and a rare few were trusted bodyguards or eunuchs. All lived within the imperial palace, many with tight routines and almost no privacy. Their lives were bound to the emperor's digestion. Imagine living that way. You eat what he eats, you drink what he drinks, but not with his power, not with his wealth, only with his risk. In fact, being the emperor's taster was not necessarily a death sentence, but it was a constant rehearsal for one, because Rome was obsessed with poison. By the 1st century CE, dozens of toxic substances had been catalogued: aconite, belladonna, hemlock, arsenic, and snake venom. The Romans used them not only to kill, but to signal status. Poison was elegant, quiet, invisible. It left no bloody tunics, no screaming guards. It killed behind a curtain, at a banquet, under the soft light of oil lamps. Some poisons acted quickly, others took days. Some were masked by honey, wine, or spices. And if the emperor had enemies, he did. Then the kitchen was a political battlefield. Food wasn't simply prepared, it was audited. Servants were monitored. Cooks were sometimes tortured after an emperor's death to confess imaginary plots. Even utensils were cleaned with boiled vinegar and silver to catch traces of toxic dust. The role of the praegustator was central in this paranoid ballet. Let's take an example. Domitian. The Emperor Domitian reigned 81 dawa, was known for his secrecy, his cruelty, and his fear of assassination. He trusted very few. His food was brought to him by only a select group of attendants. According to Suetonius, Domitian was obsessed with cleanliness, rarely dined outside the palace, and even built hidden passageways so food could reach him without being seen. His praegustator had a private chamber nearby. If the taster so much as coughed during dinner, Domitian reportedly had the dish burned and replaced. Another example, Claudius. The Emperor Claudius, awkward, bookish, underestimated, died from poison allegedly administered by his own wife Agrippina. Ancient sources differ. Some say it was mushrooms, others suggest wine or a poisoned feather used to induce vomiting. But most agree the poison slipped past the taster. How? Possibly because Agrippina used a taster she could manipulate, or because she waited until after the initial dish had been tested, then added the fatal dose in a safe dessert or tonic. Either way, Claudius died. Which raises a disturbing truth. The praegustator was only effective if the system stayed honest. If someone within the circle conspired, no amount of tasting could prevent a well-timed betrayal. So how did a taster survive? Mostly through ritual and discipline. The tasting process was organized. A typical taster's day might involve attending the morning meal preparations in the palace kitchens, watching ingredients being delivered and weighed, tasting samples in the order they would be served, recording reactions in short reports, especially for foreign or exotic ingredients, remaining in view of the emperor's guards at all times. It was less about culinary review and more like running quality control in a war zone. Many tasters also trained their senses, learning to detect bitterness, numbness, strange odors, and even the feel of dust in sauces. Some carried small charms or wore amulets believed to protect against venom. Others trusted in medical herbs, such as thistle tea, charcoal, or even crushed pearls believed to ward off toxins. Still, none of these were guarantees, because in Rome the threat didn't always come from enemies. Sometimes emperors themselves turned on their own tasters. One story, apocryphal but chilling, involves the Emperor Tiberius, who reportedly forced a guest to drink wine after accusing him of plotting against him. When the man died hours later, Tiberius blamed the taster, claiming he hadn't done his job. The taster was executed, guilt was irrelevant, survival was the only currency. And yet, strangely, some tasters managed to last decades. They became part of the imperial furniture, unseen but essential. They learned to smile at senators they suspected, to nod at kitchen boys they didn't trust, to eat each forkful with steady eyes, even as their stomach twisted. And sometimes they retired, given land, pensions, or high positions in provincial towns, a rare reward for a life spent on the edge of a fork. But let us pause for a moment and ask, what kind of person accepted such a role? Was it bravery, loyalty, or simply a lack of choice? For many slaves and servants, it was the only path upward. Serving the emperor meant being close to power, to privilege, to survival, even if that proximity could one day kill you. And for the emperor, it meant trusting someone enough to let them taste your life and your death. But what happened when a taster grew too trusted? When his name became known beyond the kitchens? When senators whispered his name and poisoners studied his habits? What happened then? In the marble corridors of imperial Rome, not all assassins carried blades. Some carried trays, some poured wine, and some, smiling, silent, served honeycakes laced with destiny. As the role of the praegustator evolved, so too did the methods of poisoning. By the 2nd century CE, those hoping to eliminate a powerful man or woman had stopped using brute force. Instead, they weaponized the ordinary: a cup of wine, a salad of olives and figs, a drop of perfumed oil on a toothpick. And so the emperor's taster was no longer just a servant. He was a shield, a living filter between the mouth of the state and the invisible hands trying to silence it. Yet despite their loyalty, tasters were increasingly caught in the crossfire of palace politics. Take the case of Lucius Junius Rusticus, an imperial servant during the rule of Commodus, the famously erratic son of Marcus Aurelius. Rusticus had once been a food official, close to Commodus's kitchens, and possibly even his taster. According to fragments in later chronicles, Rusticus had begun reporting suspicious patterns, nausea in the emperor after certain banquets, a sour note in imported wines, servants arriving with gifts from foreign allies. He kept notes, too many. Eventually he disappeared. No trial, no exile, simply gone, like many who stood too close to imperial truth. This wasn't unique. During the reign of Caracalla, several palace slaves were executed after the emperor suffered weeks of indigestion and suspected a slow-acting poison. Though historians now suspect Caracalla had a chronic illness, the fear of the invisible toxin was enough to purge half his serving staff. So how did tasters adapt? Counter-poisoning, for one. A famous Roman solution to the threat of poisoning was the Mithridatic antidote, named after King Mithridates VI of Pontus, who reportedly took small doses of poisons daily to build immunity. The recipe became legend, passed through apothecaries and scribes like a sacred charm. The original mixture is said to have contained up to 64 ingredients from myrrh and opium to chopped viper flesh. By the time of Emperor Nero, variations of the Mithridatic cure were common among elites, and tasters too began to consume small doses of suspect substances to dull their effects. Imagine that. You not only taste poison, you train your body to survive it. But it wasn't just the tasters who had to adapt. The poisoners evolved too. Some used contact poisons, smeared on cups or trays. Others favoured gastric delay toxins that wouldn't manifest until hours or days after consumption, evading detection. Still others enlisted the help of kitchen staff, bribing or blackmailing the lower ranks of palace workers to slip in powders at just the right time. And so the taster had to become more than a stomach. He had to become an investigator. Some kept coded logs of meals, matching symptoms to ingredients. Others carried talismans of Apollo Medicus, the god of healing. Some tasters allied themselves with palace physicians, cross-referencing notes to detect patterns. Still, a growing danger loomed. What if the poison wasn't meant for the emperor at all? What if the real target was someone near him? A general, a senatorial rival, a favoured wife? Then the taster's instincts were useless. Poisoning, after all, was never just personal. It was political. In the time of Severus Alexander, for instance, court tensions ran high between the emperor's mother, Julia Mammoniae, and various military factions. When a provincial governor died suddenly after a banquet, suspicion did not fall on the cook but on the menu. A dish of salted fish, reportedly untouched by the emperor, but sampled by the governor, became the subject of a frantic investigation. Was it meant for the emperor and misdelivered, or was it a targeted strike? We never learned, but the palace taster, according to a letter by the historian Herodian, was placed under house arrest, just in case. This brings us to another complication, the overlapping circles of tasting. At the height of Rome's paranoia, emperors instituted redundant testers. A typical meal might involve a primary pregustator, the first to sample, a kitchen overseer, who approved the full meal, a ronde, and even a dog or slave child, used to test especially exotic or suspicious dishes. Roman sources suggest that in desperate moments even dogs were used as tasters. Emperor Elagabalus, known for his theatrical meals and excessive caution, reportedly employed both animals and low-ranking slaves to test dishes that came from uncertain sources. Ethically monstrous? Certainly. But in the mind of a Roman emperor, survival justified the method. Still, not all tasters were expendable. Some rose to immense favour, their loyalty rewarded with land, villas, or even priestly honours. One such figure, Gaius Aelesius Maximus, is mentioned in a surviving epitaph as a faithful steward of Caesar's table, whose tongue tasted fear before every meal. He apparently served 3 emperors and died in retirement, far from Rome. His story, if only partly true, is a rare example of a taster outlasting his masters, but most did not. The turnover was high, the risks constant, the rewards minimal. Man's fine, but you feel a flicker of heat in your throat, a numbness at the edge of your tongue. Or is it just your nerves? He raises his eyes to you, waits for a nod. You give it, and in that moment you've bought another hour of peace for the empire. But what if your instincts fail next time? What if the poison is cleverer? What if you are the one being watched? The dinner ends. The emperor laughs, slaps a senator's back, and reaches for a fig stuffed with walnuts and honey. Around him, the elite of Rome swirl like perfumes in the air. generals with too many secrets, courtiers with too little to lose, wives draped in silk spun from whispers. But in the corner of the chamber, still and silent, stands a man with no title carved in marble, no statue in the forum, no bust in the basilica, just a spoon in his belt, and a stomach still turning. He is the praegustator, and though no one applauds him, the empire might have crumbled if he'd misjudged that fig. Let us now reflect on how such a man could leave a legacy, not of fame, but of quiet, survival-shaped influence. Some tasters, if they survived long enough, became more than servants. They became gatekeepers, not only of food, but of trust. In an empire as sprawling as Rome, where loyalty was often feigned and truth traded like coin, the man who proved himself with every swallow earned a unique kind of influence. Take, for example, Tiberius Claudius Murrinus, a lesser-known freedman mentioned in the letters of a provincial magistrate. He had begun life as a slave in the imperial kitchen, but by his mid-40s had been promoted to oversee not just tastings, but imperial banquets. He dictated guest lists, managed the sequence of dishes, and kept a coded ledger of which senators preferred which wines, a sort of social map for the emperor's table. In that role, Myrrinus wielded social leverage. By deciding who sat near the emperor, and when, he indirectly shaped alliances, rivalries, and even marriages, all because he had once proven himself willing to sip vinegar from a suspicious bottle. But most tasters left no letters, no monuments, only silence. It's this quietness that makes their history so slippery and so poignant. They weren't generals or philosophers, they weren't building aqueducts or delivering orations, but they held the lives of emperors in their mouths, every day for years, and through them emperors lived long enough to make decisions, some glorious, some terrible, that shaped the fate of millions. Think of this. What if a taster had died sipping Caesar's wine before the Ides of March? Would Caesar have stayed home that day, delayed the Senate meeting, lived to outmaneuver Brutus and Cassius? What if the taster had failed under Augustus? If a slow-working herb had ended the first emperor's life just months earlier, would Rome ever have stabilized? And what of the emperors who lived long enough to become tyrants, Domitian, Nero, Caracalla? What if their tasters had faltered? How many lives would have been spared or lost? In every alternate timeline, the spoon is a hinge. That is the quiet power of the taster, a job that required no sword, no scrolls, only a willingness to suffer for another man's safety. Yet their work was not without emotional cost. Many tasters lived alone, kept apart from families to minimize risk. Some were castrated, preventing ties to courtly bloodlines. A few, according to graffiti found in Pompeii, were known to carry love charms or hair rings, symbols of affection they dared not display in the palace. Because to be a taster was to be invisible, but indispensable. And what of their ends? Some died suddenly, collapsing at banquets, remembered only in a line of imperial mourning. Others disappeared, retired quietly, or exiled when an emperor grew suspicious. A rare few were rewarded, buried with modest honor in countryside villas, their tombstones etched with lines like, "He tasted for Caesar and Rome endured." But most were simply replaced. New tongues, new throats, new nerves, because the empire, like its dinners, always demanded a fresh plate. In closing this tale, let us return once more to the image of a man standing at a banquet. He holds a goblet. He glances at the emperor. He nods. You do not know his name. You never will. But in that moment, silent still, he is the most important person in Rome. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all, that in an empire of voices, power sometimes belonged to the one who said nothing, the one who swallowed first.